Every so often I get crazy writer's block. Immense writer's block. Like, I can't even get out of bed kind of writer's block. And the only solution I've found that works is to dive into some really extreme horror. I go out with a goal, and that goal is to be changed by something. Hence why I covered The Human Centipede last year and Martyrs this year, and why I almost covered Sallow, but the poo scene makes me feel really sick. But basically, I want to discover something that leaves me lying awake at night, pondering the miseries of the human condition. I think it works because you're making your brain process like mildly traumatizing stuff, which acts as a kind of creative defibrillator. You're forced to process, so you're forced to think, so you're forced to make sense of something, and then boom, literature discussion. Which brings us to Tender as the Flesh. Tender as the Flesh is a dystopian novel by Argentine author Agustina Bastarrica, focused on the exploits of main character Marcos Tejo, who we will be calling Tejo. Tejo works at Krieg Processing Plant, the most reputable slaughterhouse in the business. But it's not all roses. His wife has left the house following their baby's tragic death by SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome, leaving Tejo to navigate his life on autopilot, doing meat runs, caring for his ailing father, and avoiding his materialistic sister. And also, we humans now. I have a lot to say. So the plot of Tendi is really simple, and I'll just outline it here in like 60 seconds so you get an idea of what we're up against. Marcus Tejo, grieving husband and father, wakes up one day in a fictional world where humans eat humans instead of conventional livestock, and starts his work week by visiting the Urami Tannery, where he learns about human leather. He then visits the breeding center, where he is given a walking tour by manager El Gringo, who takes him and us through the breeding process. On day 2, he wakes up to find that El Gringo has sent him a female from his livestock selection as a goodwill gift. And then he visits his old pal and fuckmate Spinel, and they do not fuck. On day 3, he visits the zoo he used to go to as a child with his dad before the world started eating humans. He visits his father in the nursing home, and then he goes to work in the processing plant. He tours 2 employees there, one of which is secretly recording the whole time and gets dragged away at the end. His wife calls him afterwards, and it upsets him so much that he takes his dead son's cot out and burns it in the garden before falling asleep in the grass drunk. On day 4, he wakes up to find that his female livestock has left the barn while he is sleeping and come and slept next to him to keep him company. He names her Jasmine, and this moment gives him like a gross sexual awakening, and he tries to get it out of his system by chain-smoking cigarettes and visiting Spinel to give her the old 1-2. He then visits his sister and visits the zoo on the way home, but he ends up giving in to his impulses, and the moment he gets home, he rapes Jasmine. 8 months pass. On day 5 of the story, 8 months later, Jasmine is 8 months pregnant. Tejo visits a game reserve where he sees billionaires hunting livestock and non-livestock humans for sport. He then drives home past the zoo and reflects on a time where he found puppies living there. Despite his efforts to hide them, a few weeks later they were found by teenagers and murdered. On day 6, an inspector shows up and asks to see Jasmine. Having sex with your livestock is forbidden, like on pain of death. Forbidden, so he has to make a call to the inspector's boss and have him pulled away, but this is a one-time get-out-of-jail-free card, and Marcus realizes that the inspector will be back with reason to believe that he's been shagging his livestock, and then he'll get the death sentence. Afterwards, he takes Jasmine out to the tree where he buried his dogs 20 years ago and dances with her. On day 7, his dad dies, gets cremated, and Tejo spreads his ashes at the zoo at the aviary. On day 8, he visits Valka Laboratory, where evil scientist Valka uses science as a justification to torture and abuse human livestock. She winds Tejo up, he's rude back to her, and she sends him away. On his drive home, Cecilia calls him and finally tells him that she misses him. Day 9, the final day of the story, is very busy, so Tejo starts by attending his father's wake, i.e. the the farewell service. He storms out after an argument with his sister, and then gets called into work because a lorry of livestock has been attacked by scavengers who have eaten them and the lorry driver. Teo suggests some plans going forward for killing or lowering the population of the scavengers, and then goes home to find Jasmine giving birth. He calls his wife because the amniotic fluid is like brownish green, which is not good. The wife helps with the birth, and then they take the baby as their own, and the story ends with him killing Jasmine. So I have no strict structure in mind for how I'm going to tackle this analysis, and that's because Tender's structure is also quite diffuse. Even the 9 days somehow feel episodic in a way, despite them having clear cause and consequence between each other. The locations especially are not ordered by severity or relevance, so I'm not going to order my analysis by theme or character or place. So I'm just going to kind of talk about the book, I'll bring in relevant themes as we go, and we'll slowly be able to flesh out a picture of Tender is the Flesh. And we're going to start the video with the best bit, my 2 major criticisms of this book, and then we'll get to the analysis. So, what's wrong with Tender is the Flesh? We're going to dive into the deep end first and foremost with my criticisms of Tender is the Flesh. Tender Flesh is not the kind of book your average person has heard of, this Argentinian written novel about the what-ifs of social and literal cannibalism, so you'll probably encounter it in like a similar way to the way I did, i.e. on r/extremehorrorlit, a subreddit I have bookmarked half to death. In these threads, Tender Flesh is adored or hated, with no in-between, and that's because Tender Flesh is not extreme, and it's barely even horror. I picked this book up because it's life-changingly gory, but something you'll quickly learn about Tender Flesh is that the gore in this book is quite sparse. Most of it is in the rearview mirror before page 100, and the rest of this story involves a lot more talking than you'd expect a book about cannibalism to have. Tender is a lot of musing and a lot of banal evil. Like, yes, evil, but banal. Most of the gore is purely descriptive. Teo is never involved in the action. He's either watching it, describing it to us with the emotion of a school textbook, or having it described to him by equally desensitized people. Now, there is a reason for this, but the ends never really justified those means for me. Like, sure, yeah, you know, narrative purpose, but I'm here to read something that will upset me. Like, I want to be upset, and yet the impact of most of the visceral horror is damp out of the gate, limp, and uninteresting. Similar books like Meat by Joseph DeLacy were way better at capturing that gore, precisely because Joseph would take a character and then put them right in the midst of said gore. Like, there's a scene in that book where a plant worker is processed and slaughtered, firstly from his point of view, and then secondly from the POV of a worker who watches his like twitching, boiled body swinging gently through the room like mistletoe caught in a chimney draft. And it was so viscerally disgusting that I had to put my phone face down on the table and carefully finish eating the pastry that I was eating because I felt like I was going to be sick. Meat ends up becoming this very literal destroying evil by giving myself to Christ book by its conclusion, and it's not subtle about that either, so it lost me in the second half, and we can discuss it one day, but I have to wait a bit. My brother still won't sit next to me after all that reading I had to do about incest for the earlier Elden Ring video I did this year, so I've got to space out the cannibalism too, otherwise I'm not going to get invited to many functions. But yeah, Tender's extremity is wildly overstated. If you go into this book expecting thrills and gore on par with, like, the Saw series, you will be sorely, disappointed. I found the gore scenes to be pedestrian, surface-level descriptions, and I'd had the horror hyped up to me so much that I kept assuming that something even worse was going to be around the corner, and it never was. So the first time I read Tender Flesh, I didn't like it. I was bored and I was disappointed. The second time, well, if you approach Tender is the Flesh as a sort of lit fic and try to really dive into what it's saying, when you ironically set all of the actual cannibalism aside, you'll have a way better time with this book. Tender excels the moment you stop focusing on the lackluster gore and start focusing on what the author is trying to say about human evil, whether we are born with that evil or we learn it, how we lose connection with the world around us, and how we treat people who we are taught are beneath us. does. My second read-through of Tendi Flesh was borderline transcendental, because I was actually reading it, understanding motivation, consequence, and context. And then my third read-through was somewhere in the middle, because I started to actually recognise the issues again. That said, I would recommend Tender is the Flesh, not as a cheap horror novel, but as quite a compelling examination of human nature, the effects of propaganda, church versus state, and the banality of corporate, societal, and individual evil. In conclusion, the first major problem with Tendi Flesh is that extreme horror fans will be bored by it, but like the highbrow lit-fic crowd that I've seen tend to just boil it down to being shock value gore. So in the end, there's only a sliver of people that overlap with the two demographics enough to A, seek it out, and B, enjoy it. Tendi's second major issue is the way that it delivers exposition. Tender is the Flesh feels like a first draft in the worst way. It feels like the outline of a better book, like it's this web of ideas that's intended to be expanded upon in later versions, but someone's found it and skimmed the synopsis and then just published it by accident. Tender is the Flesh follows the story of Marcus Teo across 9 individual days with one big 8-month gap in the middle. He visits a tannery, a breeding centre, a processing plant, a game reserve, and a laboratory, each of which play a key role in the human meat business cycle. All the while he's taking care of a 20-year-old human livestock named Jasmine, and by taking care of her, I mean he resists raping her for 2 days, then he does, then she carries his child to term, and then he kills her. Whilst visiting each location in the story, despite having been in his job for, by my counts, like 20 plus years, one of 3 things will happen. He will either join an ongoing tour, he will give a tour, and or the head of the facility will greet him and say, "Hello Mr. Teo, it's me, the owner of this facility. We've worked together for years and have a long-standing relationship, but you know that I love to give a speech every time you arrive on site about what it is we do here, as though it's the first time we've met. I do a very well-rehearsed, passionate, and completely expository speech because I'm the kind of person who likes to do that and it makes me feel self-important." The segment of the book with the most natural exposition delivery is the game reserve, when social and professional obligation demands that Teo join an exclusive dinner with some of the richest people on the continent. But most of the groundwork on how this world works is laid by this point, so it's not so much good exposition as it is just riding on the exposition established in other areas of the book, in walking tours that Teo takes through facilities that he's worked at or with for over half of his lifespan. The first 36 pages of this book out of a total of about 216 are pure, uninterrupted passages of descriptive exposition. Chapter 1 focuses on Teo's morning routine, waking up, showering, having a hot drink, and during this time he just recalls the events of the global transition into cannibalism chronologically, whilst including differing perspectives and theories from multiple reputable in-universe sources. His inner monologue is plot recap. There has to be an easier way to deliver this information without just writing a book report. The owner of the tannery delivers the same speech every time. The owner of the breeding centre invites Teo on a tour of his facility alongside a potential buyer. His boss Krieg sends him to interview 2 employees whilst giving them a tour of the business. Care home nurse Nelida delivers clunky expositional dialogue to say, "Don't you know, hearses are no longer used because they get attacked," and Teo is like, "I am aware of that." On page 192, Teo visits Dr. Valka of Valka Labs. He knows her and he works with her. Still, she goes on this spiel. "The work we do here at Valka Labs is of vital importance, as it's through experimentation with these species that we're able to obtain good results. We've made significant advancements that we wouldn't have been able to make with animals. Like, this is how you'd address a colleague?" She explains her important work whilst walking Teo through the facility, and he's describing all of the things he's seeing: vivisections, flayings without anesthesia, and captive heads in cages with electrified floors. And she details her experiments to him because she's smug and self-important, and not because we haven't thought of a way to do this more organically. The lab especially is bigged up all the way through Tender is the Flesh, and when you get there you realise oh, there's only about 30 pages of this left, so something massive is about to happen, surely. Maybe Teo will see one of his friends there, or his captive will be there. Maybe the virus is real and it breaches containment, or maybe he has a change of heart and releases all of the captives. Maybe it's a ruse, he's been found breaching the law, and maybe the police are waiting here to drag him off to the municipal slaughterhouse. house. Maybe he sees something so awful that he drives off into the sunset and never returns to civilization again. But no, it's just a few pages of clunky, half-arsed exposition and then it's over. The consequence of this is a segment that's bigged up for 200 pages and then just falls flat on its face. Teho walks in, beholds the horrors, Valka monologues at him, he's a bit rude, and then he leaves. This is the biggest letdown of the book. Now, some of you may be thinking of saying, it's intentional. Teho just describes because he just exists. He's conformist, and his lack of opinion is a symptom of his total lack of agency. And you are right, kind of. Like, Teho does just describe, but that doesn't mean that every person he meets is the kind of person to just describe to. Teho is purely descriptive because he is a passive observer, and this passivity is triggered by the death of his newborn son, Leo. He and his wife went into debt so that they could conceive and were broken by Leo's death. Leo's death follows him throughout the book and serves two purposes. Firstly, it means he lives his life on depressed autopilot, and secondly, the vulnerability he feels makes him more sympathetic towards the captive, harvested humans he deals with on a daily basis. The descriptive nature of Teo's narration allows him to bumble through the first half of the book to the midway point of the story where he bold-facedly rapes a captive woman without having to demonstrate his own evil in the process. Like, up until that point he makes no actual decisions, and the judgments that he makes of the people around him are A, incredibly limited, he's not much of a talker, and B, made against people who are worse than him, so obviously he would still find them despicable. Having like a passive evil man surrounded by like aggressive evil people creates comparisons where he seems more moral, more humane, and this is done so that the audience will project themselves onto him. I spent a lot of time hoping that this man would find a way to escape his miserable life, not realizing that he's actually kind of exactly where he wants to be, minus a happy family. So we do have some context for the authorial choices here, but just because something's intentional doesn't mean it's well written or good. If something is intentional, it just means that we have a different context to critique it through, and I still think that this is bad because the end result is essentially a slideshow presentation of various atrocities that are blandly described to us. And I don't hate artistic choices in novels. For example, in this book, one artistic choice that I do really like is the fact that the narration never calls Marcus Tejo by his name. The narration calls him he, him, his, just pronouns only. And at first I thought this was kind of like pretentious, but then I started to realize that the more people that Tejo is talking to, usually men, the more he, him, and his identifiers just get lost in a sea of pronouns and other identifiers. So it can be really hard at points to figure out who is talking, and I started to appreciate the way that it makes him blend in with the group, like livestock. So there are some unorthodox artistic choices that work. Tender as the Flesh would benefit from a more organic drip feed of exposition and 100 extra pages. And then we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this might demonstrate the monotonous evil of human slaughterhouses, but it does very little for the story as a whole. I know it's a difficult line to walk and you do want some artistic license, but there's gotta be a better way than this. It's hard to know where to start with Tendy Flesh. Like, you could say the cannibalism stuff, because cannibalism is the foundation upon which this story is built, but the more you read, the less prevalent the actual flesh is. It's like a blanket in a loft. It just looks big because it's draped over a bunch of other junk. Marcus Tejo works as the right-hand man at Krieg Processing Plant, where human livestock, also known as heads, are slaughtered. There are no birds or mammals left on Tendy Earth. Officially, anyway. As many have pointed out, the wholesale eradication of animals would cause some kind of ecological collapse. Like, I assume the insect population would fly out of control, and a lack of animal droppings would limit how far seeds spread from trees, but I'm no expert and might need some actual experts to sound off in the comments on this one. Many have suggested that this part of the world building requires your unquestioning suspension of disbelief, but one of the many themes of Tendy Flesh is propaganda, so put a pin in this, we'll come back to it. So let's just say, for now, animals have not been an option for 20 to 30 years. And why not? Well, because they all got a virus. Every single animal in the world suddenly, unpredictably, and almost simultaneously contracted the same untreatable virus. Vaccines are ineffective, quarantine was ineffective, treatment was ineffective, and this virus is terminal for humans. Humans contract the virus by being bitten or scratched or being in any kind of contact with an infected animal, especially eating them. Also, this virus is conveniently asymptomatic, and if that sounds like bullshit to you, then congratulations. The most pivotal event of this world's history is an event called the Transition. No other historical events or individuals are referenced when Tejo is recounting events that led up to the present day. It's kind of like the entirety of human history has been globally erased, and a new dawn has begun instead. In fact, the nursing home Marcus's father is kept in is called the New Dawn Nursing Home. It feels like year one of a new calendar began the moment this virus was discovered. Like we started a fresh slate. And then, instead of animals, we started eating people. According to Tejo, groups of people had started killing in secret, and he cites a specific example of 2 unemployed Bolivians. Soon, the state was rounding up the immigrants, the marginalized, and the poor due to mounting pressure from a big money industry that had come to a halt. Extreme circumstances breed extreme viewpoints, and anti-immigration sentiment grows particularly high during periods of economic hardship. Removing immigrants so that they can be eaten satiated those attitudes and reduced overcrowding, but it didn't eliminate poverty. Nowadays, in Tender as the Flesh, there are more resources and less people to fight over them, and yet poverty is worse. Tejo tells us that there is meat, but the prices are extremely high, unaffordable for most people. I.e., this killing of marginalized groups was not a last-ditch effort to save the masses at the expense of the few. This awful, impossible choice carried out by a dictatorial government with good intentions but on a disgusting xenophobic basis. It was done to control the meat supply. Despite reducing overpopulation, the prices of meat remained too high for the common person to afford. And despite what Tejo says, most individuals in this new world are not cannibals because they can't afford to be cannibals. And herein lies the first major point of Tender is the Flesh. It was never about feeding the people. The second outcome of rounding up and slaughtering undesirable folk during an economic boiling point is that it instilled the idea in society that in the end, meat is meat, it doesn't matter where it's from. Often, during critiques of this book, you'll see people arguing things like, society wouldn't take this sitting down, not everyone is going to be okay with eating human beings, and these critiques are correct, but not in the way they think they mean. Tejo refers to the transition as being almost too quick, but the transition spanned several years, during which time people either conformed, went crazy, or died, typically by mysterious disappearance after speaking out against cannibalism, or through suicide when they realised that the world was becoming something they no longer wanted to be a part of. They couldn't stomach it anymore, if you'll pardon the pun. The good, moral people of the world were unable to cope with seeing what the world was becoming, and they left, one way or another. All of the moral people died or went insane. The transition was like a kind of rapture in a way. The sinners, by inaction or otherwise, remained. So how long ago was the transition? Well, the exact number of years doesn't really matter, but it's important to understand that the transition happened decades ago. Most people of the present day were born in a world that had already rejected animals. Marcus is somewhere between 36 and 56 years old by my counts, which is quite a broad age range to narrow down. If we use the fact that he has an elderly father, we can assume he's in his 40s, let's say he's 45 and his sister is 38. And since he is gifted a 20-year-old born in captivity female head, let's estimate that it's been 20 to 25 years since the transition. The reason for my long-winded wittering about years is because I want to demonstrate something that the book doesn't make clear. Animals have not existed for decades, kittens are as mythical to the children of the present day as dragons. Teo has this way of just going on and on about the past, and he makes very little effort to milestone his recollections in the kind of metrics we'd be able to use to get a better idea of when exactly events happened, and that it feels recent, but it's not. Teo is just extremely nostalgic for the timeline equivalent of like the 90s. This is like mid-40-somethings talking about a period before mobile phones. And that's purposeful. Teo's life is spent with one foot in the past and one foot in the present, as represented by his relationship with his father. Teo tells us about how his father snapped during the transition. The doctors diagnosed him with senile dementia, but he knew his father couldn't handle the transition. Teo feels pity for his father, but he is in a similar position and he doesn't even know it. Teo tells us about a painting his mother used to keep on the wall above the bed. It's a painting called Paris Through the Window by Russian painter Marc Chagall, who moved to Paris but missed home. The portrait is a surreal image of nostalgia, an abstract Paris with a sky like the Russian flag. Not only do Marcus and Mark have the fundamental nostalgia in common, but Marcus interprets some details of this painting very curiously. Not only does he fail to even acknowledge the Eiffel Tower in the background, but he remarks on a dark couple, a colourful window, a cat with a face, a man with a triangle parachute, and a man with two faces and a heart in his hand. For example, Teo calls the couple a dark couple, but are they dark? I mean, they're distant and they're wearing bold colours, but the idea of a dark couple evokes more sinister imagery. This couple looks like a Mary Poppins sketch, a Victorian duo spinning on a shared axis. This represents Teo's feelings about him and his wife Cecilia, and how they're locked in the same spin in the aftermath of their son's death, but pointing in different directions. They've not seen each other for a long time. Tendy Flesh is all about the loss of human connection. The colourful window represents the way that we view the past with rose-tinted glasses. Chagall is looking at Paris and seeing the things he loved about Russia. Teo is looking at the world around him and feeling nostalgia for childhood and the pre-transition world. He became an adult exactly when the transition started. So these two nostalgias are like interlocked. He misses his childhood, and his childhood was a place with animals. So it's like this perfect innocent life where the world was a better place. The cat with a face is perfect symbolism for Teo, who watched firsthand the way that the destruction of animal life coincided with the destruction of humanity. To him, animals represent humanity just as much as humanity does. We sacrificed them for a profit, and in doing so, sacrificed ourselves. The man with a triangle parachute represents his father, who floats above him. Teo recalled that when the world was chaos, his father began to want to live inside books, and he would call at 3 a.m. asking to speak with the Baron in the trees, so the man could help him get into the pages. His father told him that books were spies from a parallel dimension. Nowadays, Teo's father sits around in the New Dawn nursing home. He doesn't recognise Teo. He mumbles and on one occasion notices a bird outside, which elicits the only emotional response we see from him. On page 57, we learn that he has to be tied down when he goes to sleep because he took another senior's birthday cake in the night. The nurse notifying Teo told him they'd be restraining him from now on. He flew too close to the sun, and now he needs to be returned to Earth. His father is repeatedly compared to Icarus. He tries, he loves, he's happy, and he falls, but he flew in the first place. Everyone says he fell because he flew close to the sun, but he flew. Do you see what I mean, son? He was able to fly. It doesn't matter if you fall, if you were a bird for even just a few seconds. Finally, the man that Marcus describes as with two faces and a heart in his hand represents himself. You could suggest that the faces represent the cold, right-hand man face he shows his boss and his colleagues versus the sad, grieving blue face he keeps to himself. But you could also suggest that his two faces represent the repentant face he shows us, the way he narrates his life and includes comments about how awful everything is and how he doesn't think the same as everybody else, but then his cold white face is his real self, who takes part in society without protest. I mean, if you want to understand the themes of Tender as the Flesh, look no further than Paris. The transition happened long enough ago that many people have been born and raised post-cannibalism, both the livestock bred in captivity and the people. They are first generation pure. We are introduced to first generation pure, or FGP, on page 25 by the owner of the breeding center, a man named El Gringo. They are heads born and bred in captivity, having had no genetic modifications or injections to accelerate their growth. The ages of FGPs are tracked by tattooing their initials on them yearly, which doesn't do much for the story beyond confirming the age of Marcus's future captive surrogate as 20 years old. Whilst most meat is genetically modified to grow faster and earn a profit sooner, FGP meat is raised properly, rendering it the most expensive kind of meat. Teo calls it upper grade for refined palates, and the applicant he is giving an interview to takes that to mean that non-FGP meat is artificial and synthetic, like a living thing hasn't died either way. But I mean, think about people who only eat like organic food, won't eat GMOs. People judge meat the same way in our society. The concept of an FGP is important to this new world, not just because they represent a demographic of humans that have never known society, but because it represents a demographic of humans that have been raised to think that this is all normal and okay. The youth of today are represented by the park Teo finds in the abandoned zoo. The slide is broken, there's a seesaw missing a seat, the merry-go-round has retained its colour, but swastikas have been painted on it. People don't go outside much anymore due to concerns of the virus, so spaces like this have been left to rot. Childhood fun and innocence has been destroyed, and human connection has been lost. We now live in a society built on brutality. We meet more free-range FGPs in the story than we actually meet genuine ones. We meet Marcus's twin niece and nephew, this weird pair of 12-year-old freaks that play a game called Exquisite Corpse at the dinner table, which some of you may know is actually the Spanish name for the book, translated Cadaver Exquisito. Exquisite Corpse is actually already a thing. It's that game where you pass paper around the table and you each draw like a body part, you fold it and you pass it on, and then you unfold it and show everybody what you've done. So you might think that they're playing that, and no, they're obviously not playing that. The youth of Tendy Flesh have created a new version of Exquisite Corpse, which seems to just be guess what the person here tastes like, which can't be a long or replayable game. Teo's sister apologizes to him, explaining that it's a game that's popular now and they don't understand that they're not allowed to play it, but as a mother who became a teenager herself during the transition, she doesn't grapple the fundamental contradictions that global cannibalism is built upon. We don't eat people, we just eat people, is a message whose contradictions have passed her by, but her children have internalized the message completely. For them, it's a lesson that's metastasized. When Teo actually tells the twins how they'd taste, because he's slaughtered enough human livestock to know just by looking at them what they would taste like, they just laugh, like they find it funny. But when he looks them in the eyes as though savouring the taste of them, it startles them and they look away. The twins find playing Exquisite Corpse funny because they see captive humans as animals. Because she doesn't realise that saying we don't eat humans, we're not barbarians, doesn't compute with a pair of teens who do eat humans and don't care. They understand just fine. The other FGPs we find are the teenagers Teo finds beating a litter of puppies to death at the zoo on page 163. This scene tells us the most about the teenagers of post-transition life. They are sadistic monsters who hunt in packs and take every opportunity to dominate and torture innocent life because they weren't raised to value life. One of the puppies bites a teenager and the rest of them go quiet. They're all wary of him, like he'll go rabid any second, and they accuse him of having the virus. And the bitten teenager argues that the virus is fake. He says they're controlling us, controlling overpopulation, poverty, crime. It's obvious. The teenagers all joke about how they find and watch banned movies like Destiny is Catching Up to Us, which is the Spanish-speaking version of Soylent Green, that old movie about the future dystopia where humans are harvested and turned into green crackers. Whilst a nasty read, the point of this sequence is to show us that the teenagers of today aren't cruel because they're scared. They know the virus is fake and they abuse animals anyway. They're cruel because they've been raised in a world where the lines between good and evil have been stripped away. Humans are fine to kill and eat, be that black market humans or ethically sourced humans, which means that no one is safe. These teenagers are pure evil because they have been raised in a world devoid of good. Also, Teo is watching them and talking, he's going like, his rage ate away at him because he knew he couldn't save the pup, because he wouldn't be able to stop them on his own. And you're like, really? You know, maybe you couldn't beat up 5 teenagers creatures at once, but surely you can shout at them and threaten to send them to the municipal slaughterhouse, like scare them away a bit. Like throw a brick at them. Goddamn, man, like grow up. But it's just another one of those excuses he makes to justify why he doesn't take action when he has an opportunity to take action. Oh yeah, actually, let's talk about the municipal slaughterhouse. The municipal slaughterhouse is interesting to me because its existence is seen as a natural consequence for breaking laws. It's a punishment. Lots of crimes, including the public use of the word cannibalism, carry the death sentence. And Teo has been personally involved in sending some of those people to the municipi, but it doesn't make any sense to me. Why would a municipal slaughterhouse be used as a punishment? I mean, breeding centres produce plenty of meat, prices are high, and surely you would need a constant churn of death sentence prisoners to warrant an entire slaughterhouse. Firstly, maybe the municipal slaughterhouse is a result of the book's first draft vibes. Like, it's a cool concept that weighs heavy on Teo at the beginning of the book. Like, maybe its contradictory existence is evidence of ideas that were raised as part of the first draft, but then never properly refined. Maybe it's a vestigial limb of an early idea that just shouldn't have made it into the final draft. I'm not sure. I think I would believe this if this was something that was only mentioned once, like it was something they'd forgotten to remove from the final draft of the book, but it's quite a frequent mention for Teo. He worries about it a lot. I would only consider this an accidental inclusion if it was like an offhand mention that wasn't expanded upon, but it's in the book too often to be an accident. Another interpretation you could have is that the municipal slaughterhouse does exist, and maybe there's just like a legal framework in which your name is like officially stripped from you before you are processed, and then you're put through a fast, and then you are added to the reams of output meat. But I don't back this one either. Like, Teo works at the biggest and most prestigious processing plant in the country, and he doesn't seem to know anything about the municipal slaughterhouse. He doesn't even know where it is. It's just somewhere people get sent when they do a bad thing. How do they track whether processed meat is a prisoner's meat? How do they keep quality consistent? Do they sell it with a special label for cheap? But if most average people can't afford meat, why would they sell off-brand prisoner meat for cheap? Is it just mixed in with the rest of the meat? But surely that affects food quality. Spinell, one of the butchers that Teo befriends and shags, talks about how smoking and drinking makes the meat taste really like crap and bitter. So surely you can't sell just anybody's meat, right? Either the municipal slaughterhouse is an alias for the lethal injection and it's all completely above board standard affair, or it's not real. This world is full of examples of mass manipulation, and I think that the municipi is just the beginning. Pre-transition Earth appears to have been a time of serious inequality and overcrowding. Even before the virus, Teo recalls that people killed each other as a result of overcrowding, though none of the media outlets reported the news from this angle. Page 12 introduces the GGB virus, a virus that renders animals deadly toxic to humans. The slightest contact is lethal. Animals are asymptomatic carriers, so they can transfer the virus to many humans, and all of those humans die. But we're not told what the symptoms of the virus are, nor how it kills you, nor how quickly. And the virus cannot be treated, so once you have it, you're dead. So the state began a drive to cull all animals, and Teo recalls piles of cats and dogs in the streets burned alive, and watches reruns of shows where participants have to kill cats with a stick, risking their lives to win a car, which obviously incentivized the normalization of animal abuse and animal death, and encouraged people to indulge in their evil, set aside their humanity, and reject nature. Euthanasia needles were sold incredibly cheaply at every supermarket. He had to buy 2 of them to put down his dogs Pugliese and Coco, and he feels their absence every day. As suggested before, I don't think all animals have been eradicated. I think they've left human civilization, but Teo sees animals all the time. He sees a bird at his dad's deathbed, he sees cockroaches in his sister's house, and he hears howling at the zoo and then finds a whole family of dogs and puppies. And Valkyrie Parker Labs have loads of animals. They've just been pushed to the fringes of society. The rejection of nature is another major theme in Tender as the Flesh. How rejecting our human nature requires us to distance ourselves from the earth as a whole. We have examples of them creating physical distance. Like on a visit to see his sister, Teo sees how cities are lined with protective roofing because citizens are convinced that bird shit spreads the virus. Many denizens of this dystopia purchase umbrellas for an astronomical fee. Umbrellas have become a sort of fashion statement, and some are available with all sorts of bells and whistles like spinning fans and ventilation. The duck pond at the nursing home has been filled in and the ducks are gone. The physical distance created through the mass extermination of animals manifests as a silence nobody hears. It's a shrill silence that can be seen on people's faces. The city's pavements are cleaner now that there are no dogs, and emptier. Humanity has bored a huge hole in itself, and it has nothing to fill it with. Rejecting nature has made us lonelier by design. When we lose our connection to the earth and to each other, what else do we do for fulfillment? Well, we buy, we work, we eat, and then we die. We consume. We also have examples of social distance. Some of you may ask, why didn't the world go vegan? And the answer is, in the early days of the transition, many people tried to go vegan. Instead of encouraging this vastly more ethical diet, the media began to spin veganism like some kind of crazed, crunchy fad, with articles about revenge of the vegans. Even 30 years on, Marcus's sister asks him if he's some kind of veganoid because he tells her that he just isn't in the mood to eat meat that day. For humanity to accept cannibalism, it had to gorge on itself and see ethical alternatives as a low-class last resort for hippies and idiots. One of the major turning points in the transition was when the most eminent zoologist whose articles claimed the virus was a lie had an opportune accident. After this point, prestigious universities began to side with the government, and massive protests, hunger strikes, and complaints by human rights organizations were thwarted by articles, research, and news stories. People who refused to conform ended up dead, insane, or disgraced, and all that remained were the people who were just happy to go along with the status quo. Critics of this book often say there's no way you would be able to convince humanity to find this okay, and dismiss the story as ridiculous and impossible and stupid. But I actually don't think the premise of Tender as the Flesh is that far-fetched. When you consider that Tender as the Flesh is built on histories of extreme inequality, poverty, and overcrowding, you realise that the transition didn't occur out of nowhere. It was an extreme reactive measure in an extreme time, invoked to counter growing extremism. Sure, if a guy turned up at your door now and said, "Do you want to eat a man?" you'd say no, because you're not starving, you don't want to, you might be ethically opposed to eating people, and you might also fear the judgment of the people around you. Once you've eaten somebody, you become somebody that eats people. That's quite a social standout. But if you were starving and the media was blaming it on immigrants, and then the immigrants started to disappear, and then there was a big virus and you couldn't eat animals and you had to put your cat down or face becoming meat yourself, you would be more malleable to the idea. I mean, if you're a good person, you probably wouldn't survive the transition. The people left over after the transition is done would just be the kind of people who got all their critical thinking skills from Wish, so you might just end up killing yourself anyway. All the people of this world would hear about in those years was how great this new special meat was. They were surrounded by people who were eating it and breaking the ice for them, and creating new social norms that they eventually became outsiders to if they didn't conform. Celebrities would be endorsing this. And when you think about the fact that we have our trust in experts and scientists and virologists, etc., if they've been bullied into telling us that the animal virus is real and cannibalism is our only way out of this desert with no pushback, it will worm its way in eventually. It really bugs me when people read stories like this and go, I would never do that. I think you would complain about it until you tried it, and then you would find some way to justify it to yourself. The media of Tender as the Flesh also creates ideological distance. Animals start to become fiction like they never existed in the first place. When visiting his sister, Teo sees that the kids have a computer game called My Real Pet, and his sister explains, you create an animal and then you can pet it, play with it and feed it. Mine is a white Angora cat called Mishi. She's a kitten because I prefer baby cats, like everyone does, and one of her kids has like a dragon. But she also acknowledges that the fictionalizing is insufficient. Like she remarks that her kids will get bored of My Real Pet, like they did with their robot dog Bobby, who is well made but not the same as a real dog and now gathers dust in the garage. The fictionalizing of animals also becomes clear when we see Teo's son's cot, which he lacks the heart to throw away. His son's cot had animals on it, no clouds or humans, and no heaven and earth, but products with sweet innocent animals on them are no longer sold. They've been replaced with boats, flowers, and gnomes. Things are stripped away and never replaced, leaving voids of abstraction and silence. Only abstract concepts are allowed to remain. One of the most annoying things in this book is that Bastarika is far too concerned that we won't get the idea that the animal virus is never real to let us figure it out ourselves. The book drops enough blatant clues for us to understand that there's something fishy going on here. Like, a watchful reader is fully able to grasp alternative theories well before the first few chapters are over, especially when Teo is reflecting on the past. The idea that the virus is a lie engineered by the government to justify cannibalism as a way to address overpopulation is pitched to us by Teo on page 14. 14. I hate the way this exposition is dispensed in this book, especially in the first 35-ish pages, because it's just a flat description of the transition, which gives us plenty to work with and gives us a basis of understanding. But then Teo goes, actually, it's all a conspiracy. And I'm like, oh my god. I think this twist would have been way better implemented if it was actually just implemented as a twist and not just handed to us the moment we open the book, fundamentally changing our opinion of this in-universe government and what its intentions are. Like, I got super animated when I was writing this script because I just don't understand this insistence on making sure we are all 100% on the same page over something anyone with a brain cell could just gather themselves from reading it. Like, if this explicit comment wasn't included, the possibility would always be in the back of the reader's mind. I don't think it should have been spoken aloud until Marcus overheard those aforementioned teenagers talking about how they knew the virus was fake, but they're gonna kill puppies anyway. It just bugs me. It really bugs me. Something you'll notice about Tender as the Flesh is that, with one exception, Teo does not describe anyone's appearance in detail. We do not know anyone's age, hair colour, eye colour, complexion, height, weight, or at least not explicitly. Like, he calls a guy El Gordo, which appears to mean the fat, but El Gordo tells him his wife's got him on the skinny shakes now, so he's like El Skinny, so we get that clue. We also have El Gringo, which I've been told means white boy, and again, context clues. But when we think about, his wife, we don't even know how old she is, nor how she looks, whether she's taller than him, shorter than him, whether he's punching above his weight, or what. There are only two people Teo spends time physically describing. Number one is the German man Teo tours the breeding centre with. He's a potential buyer, he's got blonde hair, he's fair complexioned, and he's dressed in fancy new clothes. Plus, he only speaks German, so they have to use a translator for him. And Jasmine, the FGP that Teo is gifted, who also doesn't speak. He describes her a tiny bit. He describes her less than the German guy. Like, he says she's beautiful and that she smells wild and like Jasmine, and that her hair is long and oily. I wanted to be able to make a really cool observation here, like the only people Teo bothers to describe visually are people he can't communicate with, but there is another character called El Perro, the assistant to his butcher friend Spinel, who doesn't speak either, and Teo doesn't give him a passing glance, mainly because he's too busy shagging Spinel's brains out. The only way that Teo does describe people is through their words. And words are important to a man who has spent decades seeing humans as meat. The livestock's vocal cords are removed so that they're easier to control. No one wants them to talk because meat doesn't talk. There is a clear difference in Teo's mind between humans and meat. On page 16 he says, he uses technical words to refer to what is a human but will never be a person, to what is always a product. Heads to be processed, lots in the yard, lines to be run, and excrement to be sold. And this comes off like an internal thought process. Like, this is how he rationalizes the way that he differentiates them from actual humans in his mind. But in the same scene, he acts like it's a lexicon that's been put upon him. No one can call them humans because that would mean giving them an identity. Words really are all this society has left. The captive heads look like humans, and they're physically identical to humans, because they're humans, and they also even have their own language, but Teo doesn't bother to understand it. Vocalizations are important to Teo, and they connect living things to humanity, even when those living things aren't human. Whilst visiting the abandoned zoo, Teo's only connection to nature and his dwindling relationship with the past, a place he says goodbye to forever by the time his arc is complete, he sees images of howler monkeys and sulphur-crested cockatoos. Teo stops to read descriptions that say, the monkey's larynx and hyoid bone in particular are highly developed, the latter forming a large capsule that amplifies their vocalizations, and the male cockatoo raises its crest and moves its head in the shape of an 8 while it emits vocalizations. Vocalization may not be a solely human trait, but removing it from the world as a whole has distanced us from humanity. Teo eventually destroys the big, welcome to the zoo sign by the front entrance. He does it as a commitment to his present. He's tired of struggling against the world, or feeling like he's struggling against it. Like, he's still committing evil, he just starts to feel a bit bad about it. The destruction of the sign, walking away from the abandoned zoo his father used to take him to, is a way of abandoning his guilt. When Teo is gifted a first-generation pure female he calls Jasmine, he discovers that she laughs at things on the TV, draws and colours with crayons he provides, she flips through books that she can't read and she reads them for hours, she cuddles him on the sofa. He eventually takes her baby as his own because fundamentally there is no difference, and he knows there's no difference between human breds in captivity and humans living free range. Hair, eyes, height and weight don't matter to Teo because those things are also seen in livestock. What's the point if they don't actually differentiate you? Teo only differentiates individuals by how they speak. Senor Urami, owner of the tannery, has words that construct a small controlled world that's full of cracks. He chants expositional dialogue to a man he's known for years because he needs to reaffirm reality through words. El Gringo, the man who tours Teo and Egmont the German around the breeding centre, has to speak into an automatic translation machine because Egmont doesn't speak Spanish. And Egmont responds in German by speaking into his own translator, so the connection between the two of them is carried out through this proxy of machinery. El Gringo's device translates into the mechanical voice of a woman, but Egmont uses a male voice, and Teo remarks that it sounds more natural than a woman's voice. Like, what do you mean by that? When El Gringo tries to say some bullshit, saying human livestock are not pigs, although genetically similar, they don't carry the virus, the voice on the machine cracks while relaying this information, like it knows he's lying. In fact, El Gringo is accustomed to using so many double meanings when touring visitors that the translator just can't translate him properly. It comes out like garbled, extra poetic nonsense. So he has to abandon the grandiloquent definitions and speak in basics, which brings him uncomfortably close to just saying the truth. Consequently, El Gringo speaks words that weigh nothing. They're words he feels mixed with others that are incomprehensible, the mechanical words spoken by an artificial voice. He's being honest in a situation he usually obscures, and his words are so deceptive to himself and his guest that they're meaningless. Teo's boss Krieg has words that are hard-hitting but scarce. He says little and speaks slowly. On the other hand, Teo's sister's words accumulate one on top of the other, like folders piled on folders inside folders. His sister's words are like boxes filled with blank paper, so she talks a lot but says very little. Her words are empty and rotting, dry, dead and worthless, like she fills silence with waste. When she tells Marcus about the game My Real Pet, he says her words smell of detained humanity, of confinement and intense cold. She is trapped in a cage she might not even realise exists, and to acknowledge the insanity would be to look at the walls around her and recognise that she is also imprisoned in a way. Just inside her cage she is safe and fed, just like the human livestock she eats. To leave the cage would be to give up her privileged financial position and her social standing and all the associated comforts. Her weird kids barely speak, and when they do, it's to each other in whispers using secret codes and words with implied meanings. As first-generation pure children, they are indecipherable to the people around them. They don't understand and aren't understood because they're like this new breed of sociopaths that has been raised in a world that places no value on human connection. When Teo leans into their game and tells them how they'd taste, because he's eaten enough humans to be able to make an educated guess, it just makes them laugh. But his sister sees the power play, and her words get stuck inside her as though trapped in vacuum-packed plastic bags. Teo and his niece and nephew are indulging in taboo in an effort to upset one another, and her conditioning means she can't follow them there, because that would be to acknowledge cannibalism. Although Teo's sister tries to tell them off and say, like, at this table we don't whisper, we talk like adults, her lessons don't work on her children because her children don't need to be adults. They need to be human, and if you don't understand them, then you're not human. They look down on people who don't understand them and laugh at them. Even non-livestock humans are beneath them. The words only two of them understand turns others into foreigners, strangers, makes them illiterate. The twins are constantly finding a way to alienate others. Even the way they greet their uncle by saying, "Hi, Uncle Marquitos," in like robotic unison, is done with this evil smirk. They do it for a reaction because they want to creep him out. Unfortunately, their uncle is like the Heinrich Himmler of human processing, so he just doubles it and gives it back to them every time. Spinel is a woman that Teo has a sexual history with, and her words embody the way she challenges and dominates him, which makes him feel emasculated and insecure. Her words drive at his brain. They're frigid, stabbing words, like when she said no, grabbed his arms and held them against the table forcefully after he tried to touch her during a sexual encounter decades ago. The sexual encounter she led and pursued, but him touching her during said encounter is just out of the question. Like, no touching, only sex. He has sex with her later in the narrative too, as an act of domination, regaining his power from her. And it is consensual, like she's going ham on his knob and like licking blood off him and all that nonsense. But this sexual act becomes more to him about vocalization than about sexual gratification. He wants for her to scream, for her words to crack open and dissolve. And Spinel screams as though the world doesn't exist, as if it split in two and lost all meaning, as if beneath this hell was another hell from which she didn't want to escape. On the other hand, Teo's wife Cecilia's words were initially a river of light, an aerial torrent like fireflies glowing, because she originally represented a beautiful escape from a life of slaughtering humans. When they're struggling to get pregnant, he tells her everything's gonna be okay, even though he knows that it won't be, representing the way that his words hold her up, but they're a facade. Ever since they lost their baby, Cecilia's words become black holes. They begin to disappear into themselves, representing the way that her grief swallowed her whole, and now she can no longer provide with her words because her energy has collapsed inwards. No matter what he tries to fill her back up with, nothing suffices. The rich livestock breeder Guerrero Areola, like billionaire rich, exasperates Teo with the mix of Spanish and English he uses to show his roots, so that everyone knows he went to private bilingual schools and comes from a long line of breeders, first of animals, now humans. Because he highlights his unreachable pedigree by speaking in languages that people around him don't understand, similar to the way that the twins signal their detachment by using secret twin language to unnerve and exclude others. Erlit, owner of the game reserve, collects words in addition to trophies. He selects each word as though the wind would carry it away if he didn't, as though his sentences could be vitrified in the air and he could lock them away with a key in some antique furniture. To him, words are valuable enough to claim and own, like collecting words somehow makes their existence more limited. Every word he chooses is like a special edition version of that word. Dr. Valka owns Valka Labs. She's an incredibly self-centered person, another character who just chants exposition, so her words that flow like lava from a volcano that doesn't stop erupting, only it's lava that's cold and viscous. She babbles on and on, spouting hypocrisies and blagging about her accolades and takes no interest in Teo. She only cares that he's listening. Knowing that he won't be back at the lab, Teo intentionally winds her up, and he feels that the lava, cold and viscous, is on the verge of erupting, but she breathes deeply and dismisses him. Teo observes that as she walks, she sways from side to side and speaks. It's as though she needs to support herself with the words that leave her mouth without stopping. As with Irami, her speech is there to justify her existence within the machine, and also to deliver clunky exposition. Teo's time spent processing humans for slaughter has disconnected him physically from everyone around him. Even when he recalls meeting his wife, he says, when he stood up and saw her, he didn't feel anything in particular, just another nurse. But then she began to talk, and he felt like her voice could lift him up, that her voice was a way out of this world. Even the love of his life has no physicality to him. It's her voice that resonates. She just represents escape. When Teo's father dies, Teo observes how he's been perfumed and cleaned up by the nursing home nurses, but remarks he doesn't feel anything. He wants to cry and hug his father, but he looks at the body as though it was a stranger's. It's not until a hummingbird appears at the window that Teo wonders maybe it's his father's spirit saying goodbye. It's then that the stone shifts and the tears begin to fall. Only when he sees his father's spirit, or what he perceives to be his father's spirit, embodied by an animal so rare that it's borderline mythical, does he feel emotion. Because he sees dead human bodies every day. After decades of desensitization, there's no longer a difference to him. But as with many things in Tendi flesh, it's not always so simple. Words are the things around us that make us human, yes, but as Teo explores the world around him, he catalogues the ways that words are used to obscure, manipulate, and other. They're the things that make us human, but Tender as the Flesh chews on the idea that humans are not born fundamentally pure, and words represent humanity doesn't necessarily mean that words represent morality. Teo grapples with this idea on page 115 when he remembers burying his newborn son. He knew the coffin was white because of the purity of the child inside, but are we really all that pure when we arrive in the world? That's the only time in the book where he addresses this concept directly, but human evil is depicted across the story as instinctual. Like, humans are a cooperative species by nature, yes, but Tender as the Flesh drills deep into this miserable reality that groups cooperate to exclude other, less desirable groups, enslaving and exploiting those lower on the pecking order for their own benefit. It can't be acknowledged though, because to acknowledge that we do harm, to acknowledge that the only thing separating the haves and the have-nots is the brutality of the haves and the intentional deprivation of the have-nots, would be to acknowledge that we, the victors, are immoral. Consequently, free speech is no longer allowed in this dystopian future. Teo remarks that the use of the word cannibalism could cause him major problems, explaining to us that there are words that cover up the world. There are words that are convenient, hygienic, and legal. Owning slaves is prohibited, but owning living meat pantries is okay. And he recalls how families that kept female slaves were not uncommon, and those prosecuted were taken to the municipal slaughterhouse. When Egmont looks at a teasing stud, a human whose job it is to shag other female livestock so as to make them more willing to be impregnated, Egmont makes a comment about how he lives a sweet life, and El Gringo is disgusted by him. As far as El Gringo is concerned, Egmont is suggesting bestiality. When touring two applicants for the role at Krieg Processing Plant, one of them asks what happens to sick heads. Teo tells them that they follow proper procedure, but in reality, sick heads are thrown to the scavengers, who run the risk because they can't afford to buy meat. Teo calls this the official truth, which makes it a relative truth. When being served human fingers at the game reserve, Teo notices that they don't use the Spanish word for fingers. Instead, they say fresh fingers in English. Guerrero Areola, one of the richest men on the continent, can't even use literal terms when telling friends in confidence that he killed and ate a prostitute at the Lulu Cabaret, an exclusive trafficking club that allows you to buy the woman you just had sex with. All he can do is raise his fingers to his mouth in a gesture to indicate that she was tasty. The separation of official truth and relative truth is embodied by Teo's late mother and father. Their family owned the Cyprus Processing Plant, which was an animal slaughterhouse that operated before the transition, and even though his mother died 10 years before the transition began, Marcus recalled how she showed him the Salamone slaughterhouse. The building was destroyed, grey letters standing out against the backdrop of the sky. The word slaughterhouse resisted, didn't disappear, refusing to be broken down by the weather, by the wind, by the climate. Teo's mother respected the honesty in the word slaughterhouse, the refusal to hide what they were doing from the world, even back when it was just animals. Teo's father disagreed, arguing that the act of slaughter should be done in private and hidden. Perhaps the honesty of the Salamone slaughterhouse is precisely why it no longer exists, because people who are honest enough to state what they are doing aren't the kind of people who survive the transition. Teo's sister Marissa is 7 to 8 years his junior, meaning that she just has less to feel nostalgic about. Since she went through school during the transition, she was at ground zero with the kinds of media manipulation that Teo missed out on. Her growth into adulthood was moulded through the lens of mass manipulation, propaganda, and media control. She is the purest output of the propaganda campaign that shaped the transition and all its hypocrisies. Consequently, he can't stand her. One of the things I liked about Teo being an unreliable narrator is the way that, sometimes you are totally on board with him, and sometimes you're like, man, you are a top-level hater. For example, Teo resents Marissa a lot for never visiting their father, and to his credit, she drops the ball hard, and it's shocking how unrepentant she is about it. But also, their mother died when she was a baby, and their father would leave her in the care of nannies while he took Teo to the zoo, the plaza, the cinema, wherever, just to cope with the grief. Marissa is a piece of work now as an adult, she's pure evil. Don't get me wrong, but Marcos gives her a lot of shit about not visiting a dad that never spent time with her as a child. Yeah, she's vain, shallow, selfish, fake, judgmental, and hypocritical, I won't deny that, and we will cover it. But one of the moments in this book that made me raise an eyebrow is the moment that Teo reflects on his son's funeral. He remarks that at the funeral, his sister cried as though the child was her own, and in that aftermath, his sister would only call Cecilia, she would ring Cecilia on the phone as though she was the only person that needed to be consoled. All judgments of her character aside, I find it bizarre that he resents Marissa for grieving her newborn nephew so hard that she cried her eyes out at a funeral. And I love the way he resents her for only really making the effort to reach out to his wife, who is obviously really grieving. Teo, you hate your sister. You ignore her 90% of the time, and you visit her twice a year when she guilts you into it. Why are you upset that she's not talking to you about this? But again, this is just one way that this world of cannibalism has destroyed humanity's ability to connect. Marissa has a husband called Esteban, who Teo describes as a man hunched over with a face full of contradictions and a half smile that's an attempt at hiding them. He believes Esteban is a man trapped by his circumstances, by a wife who's a monument to stupidity, and by a life he regrets having chosen. Which is crazy, but it did make me laugh. He hates these people. He calls their conversations a ritual of talking about trivialities. He also gets really mad at her because she asks him not to smoke in her house, which is just, he's so rude, but he hates her so much. He's so self-righteously hateful with her that he's like, what do you mean I can't smoke in your house? Okay, Marissa defense mostly complete. Let's actually start critiquing her now. So Teo's interactions with his sister come across like a trivial, guilt-tripped ritual of habitual obligation. He doesn't visit her until page 110, and that's only after she invades his privacy to call his workplace and ask them if it's his day off, so that he has no excuse not to visit. He does visit, but he calls it an errand. He doesn't know his sister, he says. Not really. Marissa calls her brother Moquitos, which he says is to express a modicum of affection, which she doesn't feel. But Teo is a very unreliable narrator, and I do wonder if she does feel that and he's projecting his disconnect onto her. Ever since his baby died, she looked at him with pity and condescension in her eyes. She keeps it subtle, but not that subtle because she wants him to notice. Marissa spouts propaganda like it's going out of style. This is best represented by the umbrellas that she insists everyone use to shield themselves from bird poo. She is more worried that the neighbours will see her brother without an umbrella than she is about, theoretically, her brother becoming ill. And she gives him an umbrella as he leaves her house so that no one will judge her or ask questions, and he throws it in the bin in front of her, and she hangs her head in shame and walks back inside the house. In this world, umbrellas are a status symbol. Marissa is obsessed with having a good reputation as this austere, humble mother that works very hard for what she has, and it just so happens that the expensive things she buys coincides with the expensive things that the government wants you to buy, and her purchases further her and her children's brainwashing. When the twins show up with expensive umbrellas, she proudly tells her brother that those umbrellas were gifts from their grandparents. They've been asking for them for years, but they're so expensive. Not only does this demonstrate how she prizes materialism over logic and critical thinking, but Marissa is so disconnected from her and Teo's family that you forget that her children have grandparents on Esteban's side, obviously, and it's briefly disorienting because you're like, which grandparents are buying you them? Like, as far as she knows, and as far as is instinctual for her to say, they only really have one set of grandparents, which is probably pretty crushing for Teo to hear, or you'd assume it would be. Like, he doesn't say a word, to us or to her. So one of the reasons that she invites Marcus to visit her is because she wants to know if he can provide a head at a good price. The grim societal standards of tender as the flesh dictate that the fresher the meat, the more delicious it is, which means that it becomes a status symbol to have a living head in your house. All the rich families do, and they follow a bunch of different meat harvesting techniques that allow them to keep the meat fresh, i.e. by keeping the head alive for as long as possible while they cut it up. This includes the death by 1,000 cuts method, which is based on an old Chinese torture method called Ling Qi, which looks exactly how it sounds. And a lot of readers call this shock value, and I suppose it is. Like, it is shocking, but I do think there is value in this shock. It does get a message across. Like, we don't do this with animal livestock, so it comes close. It is quite, like, unnecessarily gory and unnecessarily cruel. But to me, this in-home torture method nails the point that the cruelty is the point. Dehumanization is the point. We don't have free-range heads because the lines between outer and inner people blur. The point of the propaganda is to treat these individuals like objects without needs or feelings, because to acknowledge any other possibility is to erode society's unspoken agreement that the only thing separating you from being human livestock are the circumstances of your birth. Marissa is in a very particular position where challenging her thoughts is only half the battle. Teo says to her, "In the country, at the plant, no one uses an umbrella. Wouldn't it make more sense to believe that if you get bitten by a mosquito, which could have bitten an animal before you might get the virus?" And she responds, "No, because the government says there's no risk with mosquitoes." These two factors, the fact that Marcus is living proof that umbrellas aren't necessary, and the fact that mosquitoes, some of the most prolific disease carriers in earthen history, are no threat, drives home this lingering and widespread effect of post-transition propaganda and how it has infected Marissa's brain. Even to challenge this thought, even to break through this conditioning and show her the truth, would not be the end of the line. Marissa does what she does because she lives in a city surrounded by people who would report her to whichever justice system exists if she didn't. To challenge the thoughts around her would be to disobey the country's extremely strict speech laws, and she would face the death penalty. Here, everyone uses an umbrella when they go out. It's only logical that you do that, is her, flimsy argument. She's incapable of discussing the subject further because she doesn't think for herself. Marissa fits really well into this world because the performance required to thrive in this post-cannibalism propaganda hellscape is something she's really good at. She is great at pantomiming and performing complicity, and for example she's great at performing concern for her father. Teo observes how her fork was suspended in the air as though she was genuinely surprised when he tells her that their father had an episode, and she makes endless excuses about not being able to visit him. And the thing is, she could just kind of say to Teo, "He was never there for me as a child, so I don't want to be there for him as an adult," but instead she just kind of makes a ton of excuses. She's like, "Oh, it's a really far drive, there's a curfew, I have 2 children, I have to look after the house, Esteban's working, I can't just get up and leave, I can't just organise a visit to a nursing home that's probably an hour's drive away, I have to be around all the time. And she says this with contempt, as though the world was to blame for her choices. I don't know why she just isn't honest. I feel like she's got a pretty good case to make about not visiting him, but whatever. Her performance is a facade built upon the lies told by the government. Like, the meat she cooks is apparently really tasty, but the problem is when Teo visits, he's off meat. So she offers to make him special kidneys, and when he says, oh no, I'm not eating meat at the moment, she jumps on the opportunity to call him a veganoid, which is obviously a learned derogatory term from somewhere, and she prepares him like lemonade and a vegetable salad that Teo calls artificial, meatless, cold, and flavourless. So obviously she has been kind of conditioned to include meat in every meal, to the point where everything she makes around it, like all of the sides and all of the other food on the plate, is kind of secondary. It's all about the meat for her. It's the only thing she cares to make well. So she's clearly fallen for this conditioning. The thing about Marissa is that she is rewarded for her inauthenticity, and we see this play out when their father dies and she chooses to host the wake, the farewell service. Like, it's a bit weird. Marissa is desperate to host the farewell service. Like, she calls Teo 4 times whilst he's driving home from the cremation that she said it would be impractical for her to attend. And she even offers to cover the cost, which Teo finds like extraordinarily funny. She's suspiciously enthusiastic about hosting this wake. Still, he knows that she will eventually get irritated enough to just drive directly to his house and demand the ashes in person. And he can't let her go to his house at this point because he's got a heavily pregnant FGP locked in a padded room. So he acquiesces, but he withholds at first. Like, he stays at an intentional distance. He's like, no, we're doing this on my terms. Like, he, an established rapist holding a captive surrogate in his home, has any moral leg to stand on here. Teo says, I'll bring you the urn when I want, and you'll have the farewell service when it's good for me. To him, waiting a few days to give Marissa the urn is this grand act of rebellion, and not like a cowardly extra walk around the block before coming home for dinner. As it turns out, the farewell service is an opportunity for Esteban to do some networking. It's a way for him to invite all his colleagues around to his house, show them this beautiful home, how he's really fancy and how he's definitely worth a promotion. Teo walks into this house, he walks into his father's wake and recognizes no one. He looks around the room where there isn't a single person who knows his father was captivated by birds, that he was passionately in love with his wife, and when she died, something inside him went out for good. He observes a group walking in, all holding umbrellas, representing the way that Marissa is willfully submerged within a culture of people who have drank the GGB Kool-Aid. Teo believes Marissa is the mind behind all of this madness, all of this ambition, and his evidence for this is that she is wearing a tight black dress and she's had her hair done to get ready for the event, and he thinks that this means that she is the one who's kind of orchestrating all of these moves. I don't think Esteban has a single line of dialogue in this book, which kind of adds to Tejo's impression, but it could be that Esteban's orchestrating it, or maybe they're orchestrating it together as like an equal opportunity couple. But yeah, Tejo kind of always puts the blame on her, always assumes that every bad thing that happens is directly because of her. So Marissa's farewell service is an opportunity for her to put on a show. It's a pantomime of grief that allows her guests to respond with an equal pantomime of sympathy. She places the urn with a degree of grandiloquence, so people can see how much she respects her father, and people approach her and offer condolences. She takes out a handkerchief and raises it to tearless eyes. Teo sees an electric photo frame that is circling through photographs of him and his father, only she has edited him out and photoshopped herself into the pictures instead, even in scenes where she physically wasn't born yet. Again, this indicates how little time Teo's father actually spent with his daughter. Like, if there aren't even photos of her as a child with this man, then obviously he was never taking her places and he was never having photos with her. But Teo doesn't seem to see an issue with this beyond, you're hijacking my memories of my dad to gain sympathy from your colleagues. Like, if Marissa had photos of her with her dad, she would use them to gain sympathy, but she doesn't, so she just kind of steals his photos. And the thing is, his problem here is a totally valid problem to have. Like, Marissa doesn't care about her dad, and he didn't care about her. But Teo sees Marissa's absence in photos, even as a child, to be evidence of her negligence and for it to be her fault. Whereas Marissa uses her dad to further her husband's career. Everyone loses out here. Nothing is resolved. Everyone is taking it out on the wrong person. Everyone is blaming the wrong person. Really, at the end of the day, I feel like Marcus's dad really dropped the ball here. So Teo sees his niece and nephew standing around on their phones, and they notice him too, but none of the three speak to each other. Not even at a wake are they gonna speak to each other, because they hate each other so much. And he sees this cockroach crawl down the wall and into like a basket of party favors, which terrifies a woman, and she like runs away, but it represents the way that the only real thing in this room is a cockroach, like this symbol of corruption and filth. So Marissa's facade is entirely self-serving, as best represented by a comment that Teo overhears a guest making when eating a filleted arm of the captive head Marissa and her family have purchased specially for this event. It's exquisite, really fresh. Marissa's a great hostess. You can tell how much she loved her father. These things are presented back to back as though they are natural conclusions of one another. Did you say filleted arm? I did actually, yeah. Good ear. Somehow Marissa manages to get her hands on an arm. And the rest of it. And this is what Teo realises the entire farewell service is actually about. Marissa and Esteban want to show off their status symbol without making like a big deal about it, and what better way than to capitalise on the death of a man they never visited or really knew personally. I've made a few points so far to specify that Marissa probably didn't know her father growing up. Like, Teo was definitely the favourite. He was the prodigy who got to work at the family business, whereas his sister was excluded, she wasn't involved in the family business, she was never taken anywhere, she was kept in the company of nannies, and therefore she probably wasn't that fussed on contributing to their father's nursing home costs. And we don't know. They never say. But the importance of this lack of connection is in the exploitation. Marissa is well within her rights to not really want to know her dad when she's older. Like, we don't know the full story there, but we can glean some of the context. But the thing that makes her despicable is the fact that she hijacks his farewell service, a farewell service that Teo didn't want to have, and just milks it for all it's worth, rather than just letting Teo take the ashes home and be done with it. Marcus realizes that his sister has managed to purchase herself a first-generation pure livestock, and he finds this livestock locked in a cold room that has been specifically built within her kitchen. And there's this book on the countertop that's titled Domestic Heads, Your Guide to a Death by 1,000 Cuts, which is covered in red and brown stains. As he learns, Esteban takes care of the meat, which demonstrates that this apparently silent, helpless, passenger seat husband actually is boldly complicit within Marissa's schemes to improve their social standing. So Teo feels like he could vomit. The irony here being that his sister is keeping something that she's slowly cutting up and eating, and Marcus is keeping a young female victim captive to rape, carry his child, and spoiler alert, kill once she's given birth. He is revolted by his sister for using meat for her own gain when he is doing exactly the same thing. Now, the horror of the death by 1,000 cuts trend is precisely that. It's a trend. Death by 1,000 cuts is something your trad wife or celebrity chef influencer has decided to do one day, and it's filtered down through culture, into the books, into the circles, through the short form content, and it's become a sign of repute. They've spread this idea that meat fresh off the bone tastes the best, and it's wriggled its way into the kitchens of aspirant social climbers like Marissa. This is similar to incredibly unethical meals like ortolan bunting, a dish involving ortolan birds which are force-fed grain until they double their bulk. They are then suspended upside down over a container of Armagnac and are dipped in that Armagnac brandy until they drown, and then are marinated in that brandy, which is a fate that French chefs insist is not a bad way to die. Dishes like this lay bare the heartlessness we can have as consumers when meals involve cruelty. Sometimes cruelty is the point, as it creates a feeling of exclusivity. People eating ortolan bunting do so with napkins over their heads to conceal their sins from God, in this act of like fake guilt where they're just doing the sin anyway. So in a sense, aren't you really just mocking God? Aren't you just doing it for the sake of it? Why sin at all? It's very easy not to eat ortolan bunting, but these people would do it because they could, and they could afford it. Having an FGP in your house that you can kill and can eat with the meat off the bone and cut to pieces without anesthesia is something that you can do because you can afford it. It adds you to an exclusive club of people who can sin. They can pay the price. It doesn't matter. It's more about being able to do something than it is about whether or not they should be doing it in the first place. Teo's final stand against his sister involves the refusal of an umbrella she tries to give him on his way out of the farewell service. He says to her, like, can't you see you're incapable of thinking for yourself? The only thing you do is follow the norms imposed on you. You're a hypocrite and your children are little shits. Marissa's inability to have her spell of selfishness broken is symbolized by the way she goes to follow him outside, realizes she's not brought her umbrella with her, and then runs back into the house with her hands over her head. Like, she may hear Teo, but she'll never listen, and she'll never care to escape a world that serves her and her family perfectly well. One of the best aspects of Tender as the Flesh is the characters. As Tariq writes a rich and varied cast of characters without ever bothering to differentiate them on the basis of their physical appearance. Tender as the Flesh has this way of introducing you to someone, showing you their quirks, their ambition, their evil, and then you'll be like, oh my god, this is the worst person I've ever heard of. And then Teo will walk through a door and then somehow there'll be somebody even worse on the other side. Like, rinse and repeat. Every single person is worse than the last. But that's the point. The world of Tender as the Flesh demands sacrifice. Not literally just in the burning of animals, but the destruction of nature and the eradication of humanity. It just so happens that the people most willing to do that are the people who got their foot through the door first, wrote the laws, bought up the real estate, and now rule over the ashes of the world they set fire to decades ago. The men of this new world are disgustingly smug, abusive, ambitious, megalomaniacs, often rapists, whereas the women become cold, robotic, and unreadable, which is exactly why I want to talk to you about Spinel the Butcher. So Teo knew Spinel before the transition. They worked together at his father's slaughterhouse as teenagers, and she's always had this thing for him that he's not quite reciprocated, but has frequently indulged in. So for example, when he's working at his father's slaughterhouse, Spinel led him to the butcher room and climbed on top of him and took his virginity in this physical union that sounds a lot more like a clinical appointment than actual intimacy. Spinel is so disconnected from living things that everything is just flesh to her, cuts of meat. For Spinel, touching, chopping, grinding, processing, deboning, cutting up what was once breathing is an automatic task done with precision, and that includes weird sex on a butcher's table. Teo recalls that he's only met a few female butchers and all of them have been inscrutable, impossible to decipher. And the thing I like about Spinel is that she's always been inscrutable, but now she just lives in a world where that detachment has really helped her get her foot on the ladder. Spinel is really weird, maybe sociopathic, I don't know, I'm not a psychiatrist, but her detachment from humanity has enabled her to get onto the human meat trade really early doors. So before the transition, as we learn, overpopulation put this insane pressure on resources, including animal products. So Teo recalled that poorly paid employees were forced by owners to adulterate meat so that it could be sold after it began to rot, so it would look fresh and it wouldn't smell. People would buy everything off the butcher's table, and yet employers were still somehow hemorrhaging money, allegedly forced to make up losses by buying worm-ridden FSA confiscated meat. So hiding rot has always been a part of this world. Pre-transition, it was just about snipping out yellow spots and refrigerating meat until the sour smell dissipated. But now it's all about outlawing the word cannibalism. Spinel takes to this like a duck to water. On page 40, we find that once cannibalism had been legitimized, some butcher shops reopened to be run exclusively by owners who now demanded high-quality products. The act of selling meat became highly private. Butchers received posters, not to be shown to the public, of new meat cuts and NMSA-approved labels, adapted from bovine cuts and mixed with pork cuts to make it more palatable for the human consumer. Everything becomes shrouded shrouded in evasive language, everything is intended to evade the broader issue. Cannibalism eroded the bonds between individuals, particularly in butcher shops, like the crucible of where all of this was happening. Few butchers were able to open a second location, and those who did would have a relative or a trusted friend handle affairs there for them. Like, employees would no longer factor into the meat cycle. Family-run business would be family-run business. And this was because employees would no longer be people that we have personal bonds with, similarly to livestock. So the lines between employer and employee would grow blurry, and honestly, it's probably better for all involved that we work with people we love and respect when we could theoretically be looking at a co-worker that pisses us off and physically costing them up. Hiring family members also prevents the leaking of dirty secrets. So, for example, the butchering and selling of black market meat with a first and last name, to sell a cheaper product that doesn't need to be inspected and vaccinated. Easy meat with a first and last name. Illegal meat. We don't really know where black market meat comes from, but we do have a good idea. So Tejo discovers Spinel herself carving up a bleeding dead body, i.e. a body that was not killed and drained of blood at an appropriate processing plant. So it's likely that the butchers themselves are taking money from above and from below, constantly carving up humans, which eradicates all of their own humanity. This allows them to set aside the horrors of killing and selling bodies and maximizing their own profit. Spinel was one of the butchers who adapted to this new reality, and she adapts extraordinarily well. She even sleeps at her shop. Like, this is as deep as it gets. This woman is an automaton whose only role is the production of edible meat. She has no family, barely any friends unless you count Tejo, and no presence beyond the wall of her butcher shop. As we learn, Spinel bought the shop with money she inherited and got to work at a time when other butcher shops were closed. Initially, Spinel copied the traditional cuts of beef so that the change wouldn't be as abrupt, like being in a butcher shop of the past. Over the years, the shop transformed. Upper extremities strategically avoided the word hand. Packaged feet displayed on a bed of lettuce. Today, Spinel sells brochettes made of ears and fingers, which she calls mixed brochettes. She sells eyeball liqueur and tongue à la vinaigrette. Spinel knew how to ease her business in alongside the transition. But as we began to learn, much of the transition was consumer-led. Once the wheels began to spin, the cart started to pick up momentum without needing that push from the state. Customers would request trotters. Human torsos were carcasses, and the industry took this as permission to start labeling products with euphemisms that nullified all horror. People may have said that they were uncomfortable about the idea, but really they were uncomfortable about the idea of being the first one to do it during an unstable time. So they were concerned about being judged, and they were worried about the consequences of what might happen if the government suddenly snapped back on their choice and outlawed cannibalism again. In reality, people are quite happy to indulge when it's something that they feel entitled to, like meat. Initially, Spinel only had a few customers, the maids of the rich. Spinel looked at these women with a grimace of understanding, and the maids always came back for more, with increasing confidence, until finally they stopped giving explanations. The fact that a woman ran the shop put everyone at ease, but none of them know what this woman thinks. Spinel's role as a woman within this new world serves an interesting purpose. As we learn, one of the ways the state began to pitch the mass movement towards cannibalism was through carefully directed advertising. Tejo recalls an advert featuring a woman who's beautiful but dressed conservatively, serving special food to her beautiful picket fence family, talking about how easy and delicious this new special kind of meat is. Women's place in society as comfortable, harmless providers has been repurposed to launder the image of cannibalism, and Spinel's part to play in that was significant on a local scale. She had the most customers because her role as a woman provided a more socially acceptable impression. She was approachable, and therefore her business grew the fastest. Tejo recognizes that there's something feminine beneath the brutal aura she takes care to give off, something admirable in her artificial indifference, something about her he'd like to break, as early as page 47, which is a red flag for the astute reader as to his predilections towards women, but the thing about Spinel is that she is absolutely ravenous for Tejo, and Tejo returns this in some ways, most of them subconscious. Like, later in the book, he has a dream where he sees his wife, but she has Spinell's face, and he says she's beautiful. He's never seen her so radiant. Cecilia represents an escape for Tejo, a future. She represents the possibility of having a family, a house, and a normal life. There's nothing physical between them. He's not actually attracted to her, and after the unfortunate death of their son, there's nothing emotional between them either. She is his safe bet. He loves what she represents, but not what she is. Whereas Spinell is his past, present, and his potential future if he chooses to indulge. They have something purely physical, lustful. She represents the person within Tejo that is content to live within this world, knowing he will never have to worry about how it feels to be livestock. The part of him that acts selfishly, cruelly, and takes what he wants. Because Spinell is really into it when he takes what he wants, which means that he can be as violent and sexually aggressive and even physical and suffer no consequences because she just fucking loves it. They are a match made in hell. Spinell invites him to her shop, specifically so that she can make orders to the processing plant through him, even though they both know that she could make those orders online. And he says that he's never seen her smile. She makes this comment about smiling being weird and stupid because you're showing that you're happy by revealing your skeleton to people. She talks about eating his ribs when he dies and then selling the rest of him, and this is like flirting for them. He flirts back with, "You better. No doubt I'm delicious." And he likes this because she says what no one else does. Like, she acknowledges the reality of this cruel world and that often post-death wishes are not always respected. She allows him to joke in this forbidden space. She is a safe place even if she might kill and eat him. Spinell's sexuality strikes an interesting contrast with her role within the flesh cycle. The sex between them becomes purely physical, an act of licking and feasting and eating, an indulgence of cannibalism by a different name. It's one of the only acts of human connection Tejo engages in across the book, and it's all done through the language of violence. She licks up his blood desperately, they kiss ravenously and full of rage. He bites her neck, he grabs her by the nape of her neck so that he can pull her hair, he crushes her body against the door, and when he penetrates her, he forces her to maintain eye contact. He shags her in front of her assistant El Perro, who just watches angrily from the other side of the door, which is locked. This whole act is an act of domination. It's revenge for the first sexual encounter that she was in control of and she didn't make a sound during. He hates how cold she is. Like, this is his act of revolution against her. Afterwards, she sits there naked, and it's the first time in their 30 years of back and forth that he has ever seen her fully naked, so he makes her vulnerable, he exposes her, and for the first time ever, she smiles with all of her teeth. For a while, Spinell is the strangest person that Tejo knows, besides himself, but obviously he dolls himself up in his own narration just enough to, like, evade the same kind of judgment that he puts on others. But Spinell is the first rung of a very tall ladder. Somewhere near the top of this ladder is a man named Erlet who runs the game reserve. So the game reserve is a place not unlike real-life game reserves, where rich people can pay a lot of money to hunt and kill things for sport within an enclosed area and take their trophies home to eat and display. Obviously, in Tender as the Flesh, they hunt humans at the game reserve. Krieg Processing Plant provides Erlet with athletic male specimens and, get this, heavily pregnant female specimens because apparently the pregnancy hormones make them more aggressive. Erlet specifically requests that Tejo delivers them with the fetus intact as much as possible so that they can be eaten afterwards. These naked, scared, ignorant livestock are dropped into the game reserve and left to defend themselves against the inevitable victors, pre-prepared men with guns. This section of the book is intended to highlight the cowardice of game hunters, how they say they like to be challenged by real prey, but only when they are on the business end of a state-of-the-art hunting rifle that could turn a rabbit into a fine mist. The game reserve is foreshadowed on page 50, but Tejo delays his visit to accommodate some other obligations, letting us know that it exists, but not dropping us into it too soon. The thing about Tender is the Flesh is that it's a bit of a frog at boiling point book. Places like Valka Labs and the Game Reserve would probably repel a reader if they were introduced too early, so we have to wait until later to hear about them. The Game Reserve is one of the best parts of this book, mainly because it doesn't rely on the same clunky exposition delivery as the rest of Tender as the Flesh. In this section, Bastarika weaves exposition more naturally by having the game reserve introduce new programs and open new doors, admitting Taeho into previously inaccessible inner circles. So descriptions tend to come more naturally. The thing I like about the game reserve is that it is populated almost solely by the elites, the billionaires, the people orchestrating global cannibalism. There's no need for them to talk evasively about what they do and how and why. Everything is fine between them because nothing needs to be justified. They are like-minded men who kill because it's fun and like being in the company of men who understand that impulse. On page 149, Taeho sees framed antique photos of black people being hunted for sport in Africa, dated from before the transition. And antique implies very old, right? Does that imply that it was always happening? Either way, the point of this scene is to depict how the rich will always mistreat the vulnerable and always have. Now it is just publicly acceptable. At the head of the game reserve is a man called Erlit, who I interpret as a very literal stand-in for Satan himself. So Erlit is a wealthy, powerful man who drinks wine from a glass that looks like an antique chalice. It's transparent red, made of etched crystal and decorated with something that looks to Taeho like naked women dancing around a bonfire. Erlit offers him wine, but he rejects it because he's driving, and Erlit touches the band on his ring finger, which is made from this same red crystal. Behind him hang half a dozen human heads, his hunting trophies over the years with the toughest heads. Erlit taps the table and grins at Taeho, and Taeho remarks that his nails disgust him. They're neat but long. There's something of a whale, an ancient presence to them. Erlit's nails create a need to feel the touch of his fingers. Erlit is one of those people who seems to have been part of the world since the beginning. Behind Erlit, on the bookshelf, are titles like the Necronomicon, the Book of Saint Cyprian, the Enchiridion of Pope Leo, and the Grand Grimoire, which are all books of old folk magic, and some of them are like old, dark witchcraft magic. You can tell from his mannerisms that Baz Tariqa has written an ancient evil demon that rules one of the most explicitly cruel, humanity-devoid places on the planet, and he is absolutely intrigued by Marcus Taeho. Erlit is really, really curious about this guy. He offers him drink and food, he begs to hang out with him a little bit. He tries to seek out eye contact with Taeho, even though eye contact with him makes Taeho uncomfortable. And he tries to draw Taeho into these deep conversations about good and evil, to see if he, approves of what's going on. Taeho never knows what to say to Erlit. The man looks at him as though in anticipation of some revelatory sentence or lucid word. He says the first thing that comes to mind nervously, because he can't hold Erlit's gaze, nor can he stop the feeling that inside this man there's a presence, something clawing at his body, trying to get out. Erlit is irritated by Taeho's refusal to open up. I think there's a kindred spirit to Taeho, this man with two faces, and Erlit can sense it, and he wants to bring that out of him, see his potential for evil, but Taeho disappoints him. Erlit isn't shy about demonstrating contempt for that either. Displeasure at this man who repeats his words or has nothing new to add, or whose responses don't allow for further elaboration. Erlit is great in a disgusting way because he embodies the nonchalant evil of this world, and of Marcus Taeho, who is disgusted by this man who speaks out loud the justifications that Taeho uses every single day. Since the world began, we've been eating each other. If not symbolically, then we've been literally gorging on each other. The transition has enabled us to be less hypocritical, Erlit says. And there's a gravitas to his voice as though the only answer to cruelty is be more open about it. In this world, more cruelty is all there is because the good people are dead or gone. There seems to be no natural option to Erlit beyond just indulging further in evil. There's no point to him in trying to be better. The relationship is exemplified in this really stupid conversation the pair of them have on page 152. It's this really pseudo-intellectual, smug, libertarian speech that basically the two of them just pass back and forth, and I will just read it to you how it is so that you can get the gist of why it annoys me so much. It follows the reveal that Erlit has introduced a new program to the game reserve where famous people who have fallen on hard times and fallen into debt can basically reach out to him and organise to stay on the game reserve for a period of time, differing lengths depending on how much debt they owe, and if they survive to the end, he will write their debt off personally. Literally a deal with the devil. Taeho. So they're willing to die because they owe money? Erlit. There are people There are people willing to do atrocious things for a lot less, like hunting someone famous and eating them. Teo, does this pose a moral dilemma for you? Do you find it atrocious? Erlit, not at all. The human being is complex, and I find the vile acts, contradictions, and sublimities characteristic of our condition astonishing. Our existence would be an exasperating shade of grey if we were flawless. Teo, then why do you consider it atrocious? Erlit, because it is. That's what's incredible, that we accept our excesses, we naturalise them, we embrace our primitive essence. I love Erlit because I hate him. Teo says, do you think it's atrocious that we hunt and eat people? And Erlit goes, I mean, life would be boring if we had no flaws. Like the two are remotely comparable. I'm not asking you to be flawless, my guy, I'm just thinking we need to reconsider the terms of service here. Obviously, he thinks our existence would be an exasperating shade of grey if we were all flawless, because he's at the top of the food chain. He's the one who doesn't have to be flawless, because he doesn't need to worry about the consequences. Listening to this man talk is like listening to a 15-year-old neoliberal talk about morality. I guarantee there's already someone in the comments going, he's right though, we should all indulge in evil things because evil is natural. Also, my daddy pays for me to go to private school. Remember when we talked about Ortolan bunting like all those fucking hours ago? Yeah, well, the game reserve introduces that exact kind of demographic. The fake humble. The people who pretend to enjoy the culinary arts but really just want to engage in the cruelest form of domination, cooking and eating people. Erlit likes eating living things because there's something he finds really appealing about gaining dominion over something in such a complete way, snuffing out lives as a result of power and ambition, absorbing people into yourself. On page 148 he says, there's a vibration, a subtle and fragile heat that makes a living being particularly delicious. You're extracting life by the mouthful. It's the pleasure of knowing that because of your intent, your actions, this being has ceased to exist. It's the feeling of a complex and precious organism expiring little by little and also becoming part of you. For always, I find this miracle fascinating, this possibility of an indissoluble union. Teo wonders whether the soul he can see trapped behind Erlit's eyes is someone he ate, that it's an entity that lives under his skin, and if he looks Erlit in the eye, then he'll set the creature free. I like to think that the person inside Erlit is Erlit, trapped, watching helplessly while the devil steals his body and uses it to commit evil. Maybe he lost his soul in a deal of his own. Something you may have noticed by now is that there are a lot of immigrants in Tender is the Flesh, which is interesting considering immigrants were apparently the first demographic to go. Even before cannibalism was normalised and legalised, Bolivians were being taken off the street and eaten, and immigrants were being consumed en masse. We have Senor Arami of the Tannery, we have the German surnamed Krieg and Spinell, the Romanian Erlit, and the Czech Dr. Valka, who has earned the moniker Joseph Mengele for her crimes against humanity. Argentina is a mixing pot culturally for a few reasons, but I am very curious to understand why immigrants were apparently targeted, and yet also immigrants seem to be running the place. All of the people in power that Marcus Tejo meets are of European or Japanese descent, and Erlit particularly is even literally from Romania. He was born in Romania and moved to Argentina. Now, obviously, there are a lot of Japanese people living in South America. Japanese immigrants began coming to Latin America in the late 1800s when this became possible after Japan was forced to lift its long policy since the 1600s of maintaining a closed country. Early immigration to Latin America from the late 1800s on, increased immigration to Latin America from the 1920s because of the US desire to limit or eliminate immigration from Asia, done under the so-called Gentleman's Agreement, resulted in potential immigration to the United States being diverted to Latin America instead, and a migrant wave following World War II when many Japanese emigrated to Latin America after the overwhelming destruction of Japan during the war. On the other hand, Germans are the fifth largest ethnic group in Argentina. Now, you can make the obvious jokes, 2 world wars and 1 World Cup, doodah doodah, but a phenomenon called the Great European Immigration Wave began as early as 1869 and continued through to the beginning of World War I, exponentially increasing European demographics, particularly German, in Argentina. So while Tejo states that immigrants went first, I do think the writing is being self-aware and having characters of different ethnic backgrounds, particularly in positions of power. You could argue that Krieg, Urami and Spinel were born in Argentina, and maybe they were, but Ehrlich was born in Romania, and that's made pretty clear. And also, as someone who lives in England, there is immense racism against people of different ethnic backgrounds here, even if they were born in England. If their parents came from places like India or Pakistan especially, the racism doesn't really stop, no matter what's on your passport. Was Ehrlich accepted in Argentina because he's rich, powerful, European descent? Are only immigrants from poorer countries and continents considered to be low enough to be turned into human cattle? Is it a racial purity thing? Racial representation in Tendi flesh is a topic you could do an entire video on, just like you could do an entire video on the treatment of women or what the book is suggesting about wealth. And I bemoan the fact that I decided very early on in the process that this video would be like a general full analysis and not one with a more targeted question-answer template, because now I realise that I'm not going to be able to do those topics justice, but I do want to talk about them. The clearest way we see this is with Urami, who runs the tannery. So for those who aren't aware, a tannery is basically a workshop where animal skins are turned into leather. So while you could argue, at a stretch, but you could argue it, that the processing of human meat served a necessary evil in extreme times as an extreme measure to counter an overpopulated, starving world, you can't reasonably argue that these people need to become handbags too. The tannery is a great place for the book to start because it's a ridiculous premise that frames a ridiculous world full of hypocrisies. The tannery embodies the core of where this cull began, the roots of generations of prejudice and privilege. Race. Urami explains to Tejo in a very clunky expositional way that white skins are the most valuable kind, and also the ones that bruise the most easily. Black skin isn't even typically used because it's not considered desirable, but when a famous fashion designer decides that he suddenly wants to create a line of black handbags, Urami stops and tells Tejo that he wants black skins this time. The point of this segment is the hypocrisy, the pure and simple race hierarchy that underpins the horrific mistreatment of human beings in this fictional world. Black is undesirable until a famous man sees value in it, and then the price soars, but no one at the bottom of that chain feels any benefit. Tender as the Flesh critiques the way that many people and populations are anti-immigrant, but don't bat an eye that their neighbour is from New Zealand, or the restaurant in town has Italian owners, or that their new co-worker is from Japan. It depicts a world in which immigrants were so undesirable that they were snatched off the streets and eaten, and when they were gone, human livestock was produced wholesale, but racial hierarchy factors in nonetheless, prizing immigrants that are not considered to be from poorer countries like Bolivia. Wow, I have been recording for a while. I hope this video is long enough. Right, so next. Church and state. One of my favourite parts of Tender as the Flesh is Tejo's meeting with the Church of Immolation. The name is ironic, not just because immolate means broadly to sacrifice, but specifically to do so by setting that person on fire, but also because it's called a church. The Church of Immolation worships no god, rather it just serves as a way to euthanize poor elderly people without anybody being accused of murder. But killing people is normalised in this world anyway, you might say, but that's not strictly semantically true, because the human livestock in this world are not considered to be people. It's still illegal to kill people in the world of Tendi flesh, and euthanizing the elderly is completely illegal. Turning it into this big song and dance where the elderly get to feel like they're sacrificing themselves to join a great meat cycle and feed civilization provides a flimsy excuse for the state to take the strain off overcrowded nursing homes. The rough idea we are given is that the church basically fought for access to processing plants for years so that they might immolate people there ethically, but obviously processing plants didn't want anything to fucking do with them. According to Tejo, their success occurred only after the addition of a member with high-ranking contacts and a lot of means. So basically, they got the right person in the door to shake the right hands, and essentially the plants started to get offered tax breaks by the government for letting the church in. The church got to practice their assisted suicide scheme, and everybody wins, except the victims. The Church of Immolation represents systemic elder abuse and sacrifice, the brainwashing, drugging, and removal of elderly people that takes place when they are no longer useful and too expensive to the state to be kept alive. The sacrificed person's meat is given a special certificate for consumption by those most in need with no further explanation, and everyone continues going about their day, content to wash their hands of these social burdens. Teo feels no sympathy for these people because he sees no value in a long life. He observes the elderly of the nursing home as people who have been alive for many years, and perhaps that's their only achievement. People who watch television and wait to die. The nursing home is repeatedly contrasted with the processing plant as a place of human death and harvest. And Teo completely writes off the idea that any elderly person could have been valuable in any way. They're old, so he automatically just assumes that their age is their only achievement. So Teo has a problem with it, but he doesn't have the problem with it. He says, allowing the church into processing plants eliminated the problem of a group of lunatics who jeopardized the whole false structure built around the legitimization of cannibalism. If a person with a first and last name can be eaten legally and they're not considered a product, what's stopping anyone from eating anyone else? Which is true, but this point stands for basically any part of the machine of tender as the flesh. The key issue is that the Church of Immolation is a tool used by high-ranking officials to remove members of society cleanly. And we see this when an unusual face shows up at the plant. A young woman who has been chosen by the church to die. Usually it's old people or the mentally ill, as Teo reflects that those who don't vomit, cry, or wet themselves are either heavily drugged or severely psychotic. And we know this because this woman's arrival is very controversial at Krieg processing plant. Krieg's secretary Mari is a woman that Teo describes as coming across as fragile, but he knows that if this woman was told to slaughter the whole shipment, she would do it on her own without a single muscle in her body trembling. She's cold. Not as cold as Spinel, but cold. And Mari is devastated to see a wasted woman's life. She flies into hysterics, saying a young woman committing suicide is an atrocity. No one is saving the planet. She wouldn't allow lunatics to brainwash a woman so young. My interpretation of this young woman's arrival at the plant is that she is a naive, exploited member of the church who may have been raised within the church and has now done something to offend an upper-ranking member. Maybe she's rejected them, maybe she got pregnant with a married leader's child, maybe she's been abused and now they just want to destroy the evidence. But either way, she is evidence of something that needs to be eradicated, and she can't go to the municipal slaughterhouse if it exists because that requires a trial, so she has to be wiped away in another manner, something quicker. On page 139 we are explicitly told that she did not volunteer for this. The church chose her for this. The irony of her arrival at the plant is that her execution occurs on the same day that Teo finds that the first generation pure he's been keeping locked in his house is pregnant. Oh my god, we've not even discussed Jasmine yet. This video essay is going to be longer than the book itself, but I hope it's a testament to how much this story resonated with me and how worthwhile I believe this read to be. So they sacrificed a bunch of elderly people before they sacrificed this young woman, and because they were only dealing with the elderly and the infirm, they were able to do it all pretty loosely with like minimal precautions and minimal controls. But when a young lucid woman walks in through the door and the church members just barrel off in a white van with barely a goodbye, she gets walked past the offal room where she can see all of the guts and stuff being processed. She gets grabbed by a stunner who, to Teo's recollection, is somewhat violent and disrespectful. She freaks out and runs for her life, and they kill her anyway. The thing about this place is that you can't change your mind, you can't revoke your consent, and you probably didn't even give your consent in the first place. The man we see immolated in the story is a man named Gaston. He and the church gather in the lobby. They're all wearing white except the sacrifice, who wears red, and they all have shaved heads. Gaston, a man who is clearly, like, not all there anymore, gives a rousing speech about how he's feeding the world. The human being is the cause of all evil in this world. We are our own virus. My life will take on meaning once my body feeds another human being who truly needs it. Why waste my protein value in meaningless cremation? I've lived my life, that's good enough for me. As Jesus said, take and eat my body. As he does so, the leader of the group hands over the permits in an affair that is nowhere near as grand as Gaston believes this to be. It's a sacrifice permit. One free euthanized old man, please. Teo observes that Gaston appears to be in a state of ecstasy, so he knows that the man is either drugged or hyped up on bullshit, and doesn't care and does nothing. As the time of Gaston's death gets closer, he pales and trembles, becoming confused. Like, clearly he assumed there would be more fanfare here. Teo tranquilizes him too, to keep his reaction as non-violent as possible, like it's an inconvenience when people change their mind. The thing is, Teo can't use meat of the immolated in the plant, not because it's wildly unethical to be a victim of a cost-saving scheme, but because of him, it's unethical to serve low-quality, cheap meat to people. Immolators are checked over before they're killed by a doctor for their physical wellness. I mean, not their mental wellness, obviously, because then they wouldn't be fit enough to do this. They are then put through a fast, and then they are sent to the plant. So they are somewhat clean, as in like the last 24 hours of stuff isn't in their body, but they're still not pumped full of the same hormones, antibiotics, and treatments that standard livestock are. Teo sees this as a situation of being too close to the line, like too close to real cannibalism, so he has a different plan for them. He feeds them to the scavengers. The scavengers are an interesting aspect of this world because they lay bare to us the extent of Teo's role as an unreliable narrator. Marie calls them filth, scum that should have been killed long ago, lurking like cockroaches. Not humans, but degenerates, wild animals. The scavengers are people with machetes who used to climb over the fence and pinch meat from the processing plant, but the fence is electrified and now they just lurk out back and wait. They make do with the leftovers, the pieces that don't have commercial use, with the diseased meat, with what no one would eat. The irony of being fed to scavengers is that the Church of Immolation think that they're disgusting. Society regards them as being of no value, so they have to keep it a secret from the church. They just bonk these people on the head and toss them out back like a bit of bird feed, and the scavengers cut them to pieces on the spot. Church meat is a delicacy for them because it's fresh. He pities them in a way. He tries to see giving sick livestock and church members to scavengers as an act of charity or mercy because the craving for meat is apparently dangerous. That latter point to me seems like propaganda. Like, we are told that the meat in this universe is highly addictive because of the chemicals that they put into it, but Teo just stopped eating meat one day. He's temporarily off meat and he has absolutely zero withdrawals. He doesn't think about it at all. He doesn't even realise that he kind of missed the taste of it until he tries it again. So from the perspective of our narrator, it doesn't really seem like the meat is particularly addictive. I think they just mean it in the sense of addictive as in like delicious. The scavengers are interesting to me because in and among all of the offhand comments Teo makes about how disgusting they are, he lets slip that they're actually just people who can't afford meat. Most people in this universe can't afford meat. These people just so happen to really want it. They initially inspire mental images of like wild living people, almost tribal, but the more of an impression I started to get, the more I started to think that they might not even be like homeless. I think they're just people who can't afford meat and will just get it however they can. Vibe-wise, they remind me more of like trading card scalpers than they do barbarians. In a sense, they're just like Marissa. They represent a wish to rise socially in a world where human meat is the only indicator of wealth. They become kind of pathetic in their desperation. They'll never reach the heights they want, but they abandon humanity because it's the thing they've seen rich people do, and therefore that must be the key to their success. They think it's all they need to do to be like them. When the scavengers overturn a lorry carrying livestock and kill the driver, they use knives, sticks, machetes, and ropes to kill the heads inside. Teo observes desperation and hunger, rabid madness, and ingrained resentment. He sees murder. He sees the scavenger cutting the arm off a live head. He sees another scavenger lasso an escaping head. He sees women with babies on their backs with machetes, cutting off limbs, hands, and feet. He sees a boy no older than 6 dragging an arm. Like, it's just families. The thing about the transition is that scavengers are proof that cannibalism hasn't reduced poverty. No one was crashing lorries and stealing animals before, no families at least. This poverty is worse. The solution pitched to solve overpopulation was just a ruse that was used to lower society's inhibitions and allow the worst people on Earth to do the worst things you can imagine, and the scavengers are kind of the victims that now just perpetuate that same cycle in a more literal sense. There's a quote on page 79 of Tender as the Flesh that summarises the entire message of this book in one fell swoop. One can get used to almost anything except the death of a child. This is a man who constantly internally verbalises horror at what he's seeing and uses that consequence-free judgment as a moral jumping off point to actually just go along with it all. Tejo is a difficult character to understand because the views he narrates to us are contradictory to his actions. He says one thing to us and then he does something else completely different. He consistently does the wrong thing in almost every situation he's in, but continues to morally judge every single person around him for kind of just doing exactly the same thing he does. Judgment is a huge theme in this story, and there are moments in this book where it is suggested that Tejo isn't even living in our reality. It's suggested that he is literally in hell. Not only do we meet Satan at a game reserve, but something I noticed across the book is that sweat is used as a motif for morally grey people who commit sin. Satan doesn't sweat, but neither does Tejo's father or Marissa. They are people who have chosen their side and don't feel any guilt about what they're doing, whether that's good or evil. Yet, even when it's explicitly not hot, Tejo is constantly sweating. He wakes up in a pool of sweat after dreaming dreams of slaughter. He wipes sweat off his forehead when visiting the processing plant where he works. He sweats when an inspector visits his home and narrowly misses seeing an 8-month pregnant Jasmine. He sweats when he visits the zoo that reminds him of his father, and most importantly, he wakes up covered in a film of sweat after raping Jasmine and specifically comments that it is not hot outside. So why is he sweating? I think sweat is used as a sign of like pathetic, repentant sin. People who constantly choose to commit evil but beat themselves up about it every step of the way. People who choose to commit rape, a totally avoidable crime, an extremely easy thing to not do to somebody else, and somehow keep finding ways to justify that to themselves. Tejo tours an applicant through the processing plant who surprises Tejo with his comfort about the meat cycle. This guy calls humans the meat and makes blasé comments that Tejo doesn't even notice because he's too busy scowling at another applicant who is like really obviously gleeful about the atrocities. At the sight of the desensitization room, the tall applicant gets like all pale and sweaty, but he composes himself, which completely surprises Tejo. Didn't expect him to be able to do that at all. While the sweat indicates, you know, this guy is feeling nauseous at what he's seeing, I think it also indicates his ability to be repulsed but to keep going anyway. When Cecilia steals Jasmine's baby at the end of the book, she has a smile lighting up her face, but she is also covered in sweat. Why? You could suggest that she is sweaty because she has used this woman as a surrogate to the point of feeling like she herself has had the baby, but I also think it's a sign of sin so recent that it's not even settled. Sin she may start to feel conflicted about once the excitement of having a new child has waned. The death of Tejo's infant son Leo shortly before the story defines the person that Tejo is when we meet him, but not the person he's always been, and you can see this subtly in the way that other people talk to and about him. Oscar, the processing plant security guard, is terrified of him, which strikes us as odd because all Tejo seems to do is sit around sadly in his car, crying and smoking. But it's true. This is Tejo's environment. This is where he thrives. He didn't become the right-hand man of this processing plant by doing nothing. The only thing holding Tejo back from embracing his latent evil is his father, who has suffered enough, and he doesn't want to disappoint him. Once his father is dead, Tejo spreads his ashes in an aviary, and then is happy to acknowledge his father is free from the madness that he then goes on to embrace. Leo's son's death also characterizes Cecilia, who maintains a very literal distance from the reader by spending over 200 pages of the book hiding away at home, dealing with her grief privately, living with her mum again. As you can imagine, as is completely natural, it takes her a really long time to recover to the point where she can even be on the phone with Tejo again. And obviously there is the grief element of this here. I think it's done very well. I think it's done very realistically. But this also gives Cecilia like this window of innocence where we don't judge her because we don't know her. All we see when we think of her at first is this image of like this friend frail, grieving mother in a fluttering white nightgown standing sadly by the window. But when we meet her, she is a very confident and capable nurse who puts her feelings aside in the moment to help Jasmine deliver a baby, and then she steals the baby, without question. She doesn't even ask Taeho what she should do, she just takes the baby. She knows it's for her, and all she says to Taeho is, just wash the female off before you put her back in the barn. Like, she gets straight into it. She's a natural baby stealer. Taeho's inner conflict about his life is characterized by 3 of his colleagues: Ensi, Pedro, and Sergio. Ensi, short for encyclopedia, is a worker who earned his nickname because he knew the meanings of complex words. He was a young man working at the plant who began to change little by little. Killing humans all day probably takes quite a toll on the good people, and one day he snapped. He took a chainsaw and tried to set free as many heads as possible by cutting their cages open and shouting at them to run as though they understood what he was saying. The thing is, the livestock have human potential, but they're also conditioned into submission. Some of them just left, like wandering out, awkward and confused, not really knowing what to do, like casting their eyes over their shoulder, but most of them stayed in their cages. Taeho recalls with surprising condescension that his subversive act only succeeded in delaying the slaughter by a few hours. The ones who benefited were the employees who got to take a break. He's the kind of guy who talks about like how protest is meaningless. He's one of those people who goes like, all you're doing is making employees clean up your mess. You know, you're hurting the little guys by protesting, not the higher-ups. But Taeho prides himself on being a morally neutral employee at the human slaughter factory. So this is the copium he takes to justify why he does absolutely nothing to help ever. Taeho's the kind of guy who chooses inaction every time. Even when he has an opportunity to save a litter of puppies from being beaten to death by teenagers, he just goes, well, there's nothing I can do, and leaves. He is one of those people where even when, in private, not under the eye of the surveillance state, he has an opportunity to do one tiny good thing for something else, he will always choose not to do something. He will always just watch and justify why he does absolutely nothing. This is a man who enacts 0 positive change on the world around him. You're not asking him to overthrow the government, but he does absolutely nothing positive to anybody around him, even when he has an opportunity, even when he could do it privately, and even when there are no consequences for him for doing it. So at the end of the day, Ensi lost his job because someone broken can't be fixed, and he goes home and he shoots himself. Taeho tells us that he wishes he could break like Ensi, but the collapse never comes. And that's how he does what he does, because he reframes Ensi's act of ineffective but moral good as breaking, and not snapping out of the lunacy involved in convincing yourself that there's nothing you could possibly do to make the world a better place. Ensi represents the person he could be: good but unemployed, disgraced, moral but dead, an actual free thinker who looks at the machine he's been placed into and thinks, just because it exists doesn't mean it has to. The next man is Pedro Manzanillo, who hates Taeho for his involvement in Ensi's firing and suicide. He chainsaws in a rage whenever he sees Taeho at work, always on edge. Taeho tries not to cross paths with him, but it's unavoidable. Taeho takes this like witheringly proud, unrepentant attitude with I wrote his name as Pedo. Taeho takes this witheringly proud, unrepentant attitude with Pedro. He holds the man's gaze because he knows what he did needed to be done and he doesn't feel guilty about it, referring to the fact that he is the person who fired Ensi, and remarks that it'll be a cause for concern when hatred no longer keeps him going. Hatred gives one strength. Like he's Master Oogway with this like infinite patience for lesser men. Like he allows Pedro to hate him out of some self-sacrificial respect. Like he's a provider and a leader, and he's just being what these people need him to be. Pedro represents Taeho's occasional moments of lucid self-loathing. Self-loathing he reasons away for actions he completely justifies. Taeho has a lot of inner monologues about how repulsive everyone else is, how he's surrounded by sheep, how the livestock are clearly human, but it's illegal to even speak the words. But when push comes to shove, he is the snivelling underdog of the plant owner, and he would never ever publicly step out of line. Like I said before, he doesn't even commit moral acts when he has an opportunity to do good without any consequence to himself. In fact, even in secret, he does bad things. Finally, we have Sergio. Sergio is another another red flag that you will notice if you are reading with the intention of looking past the narrator's unreliability, which I wasn't on first read, for the record. I was taking him at face value because I'm a gullible idiot who was like, well, he's got no reason to lie. Sergio's a stunner. Not like glamorous, but like he puts a shackle around the necks of Livestock and Gaston eventually, whispers something secret to them to calm them down, and then bonks them on the head with a club to stun them, make them unconscious so that they can be killed. He is really passionate about this job. He enthusiastically tells the touring plant applicants that if you strike them dead, you've ruined the meat. If you don't knock them unconscious and they're alive on slaughter, you've also ruined the meat. Sergio is the plant's best stunner. He's a monstrous man, a man who justifies what he does by saying that people were fed and that was something he was proud of. Sergio kept talking, but he couldn't listen any longer. It was the only thing he knew how to do, and it paid well. Whenever he felt remorse, he thought of his children and how the work enabled him to give them a better life. Basically, Sergio's like, well, it's me or them, even though it's not. To be livestock, you have to be born as livestock. Sergio does what he does because it pays well, and he operates on the basis of a moral fallacy. You're not stunning heads every day because you would be one otherwise, or because the only alternative would be to starve. You're stunning them because it's good money. Sergio's actual outlook is exemplified by his statement that everything has purpose in life, and the purpose of meat is to be slaughtered and then eaten. Livestock are objects with purpose to him, like how scissors are made to cut and Buzz Lightyear toys are made to be fished out of the lower intestine. He essentially says to them like, this is your lot in life, suck it up, get over it, which is very easy to say when it's not you. Naturally, Sergio is Teo's best mate. Sergio is the only one who doesn't take the piss out of Teo for being Krieg's lapdog, and when Leo died he didn't make this big deal of saying things like, oh, he's an angel now, you know, kind of like insensitive stuff that really wouldn't be all that productive. So they go for an occasional beer. Sergio's words are simple, clear. They're words that don't have sharp edges. They're like a pill that goes down very easy for Tejo. Sergio is the person that Tejo really is. The person he pretends to us that he's not. The person he is when he's not grieving his son. And the person he becomes again by the end of the book. As shown by the way that Tejo learns his own way to calm a head before stunning them. Okay, now we've hit the 10-minute mark and I can finally monetize this baby. Let's talk about the central storyline of Tender as the Flesh, the story of Jasmine. Considering Tender as the Flesh spans 9 individual days, it doesn't always strike you how time is moving because stuff is just happening constantly. Tejo will visit like 2 or 3 places in a single day on a meat run, which makes this ordeal feel like it spans weeks. But no, it's only a few days, and so it's really easy for him to convince you that he had Jasmine for a long time before he collapsed under the weight of his impulses and raped her. But actually, it takes him 2 days. Sexual assault and the, general exploitation of women is a running theme in Tender as the Flesh. For example, El Gringo, who tours Tejo through the breeding center, brags about the miracle medicinal use of pregnant blood, but bemoans that taking said blood causes the pregnant livestock to become anemic and miscarry. And then he has the gall to say that female livestock are skittish and have short productive lives because they get stressed easily. Like, he's stunned that impregnating and aborting over and over again is somehow stressful. When Tejo shows up at the plant, he receives a report that a member of the contracted security team has raped a female to death overnight and just tossed the body back in the cage with the others. The Food Standards Agency has to be called and a police report filed for the destruction of movable property. Plus, obviously, the security company has to reimburse Krieg for the value of the female. Towards the end of the book, Dr. Valker goes on a huge rant about how hard it is to be a woman in science and how much she's sacrificed for people to still assume that her male assistant is Dr. Valker. How she is punished daily for choosing not to have a family. But Tejo knows that should one of her assistants get pregnant, she would treat them like shit for it. Choice is only available for the powerful, and while Dr. Valker might experience sexism, she acts like a magnifying glass, projecting those hypocrisies tenfold on her assistants. He tells us that Jasmine appeals to him because she smells wild. She's dirty, her hair is oily. He finds her attractive, but remarks that it's not unusual to find the occasional female head attractive, and God, I wonder why. And there's this one scene where he lies next to her and like traces her body with his fingertip, remarking, "She's gorgeous, but her beauty is useless." The thought doesn't surprise him, but he doesn't linger on it. It's what he thinks whenever there's a head he notices at the processing plant. I think he just likes having power. On page 95, he says, something about this excites him, this closeness, this possibility. And the possibility of what? Jasmine doesn't know what sex is, but he seems to consider this like a mutual attraction. It's not very easy to discern when exactly he decides to rape Jasmine. Firstly, when exactly he decides he's gonna have sex with her in the first place, and secondly, whether he plans to do this so that she can be a surrogate from the beginning, or whether he realizes she's pregnant and then just jumps on the opportunity to take advantage of these circumstances. Like, there's this moment on page 91 where he burns Leo's cot, and he remarks then that he no longer cares if the female escapes. But when he wakes up next to her in the morning and sees her naked, he gets so horny that he goes and shags Spinell's brains out for the first time in 30 years, and then smokes 5 cigarettes on the drive home. He's not consciously resisting his urges, but he is also, like, obviously fighting his urges. He has a woman willing to engage with him sexually, Spinell, his, like, intellectual and moral equal, but Spinell's interactions are this fight for domination. She's a woman that he has to impress, and while she is willing, she knows enough to be able to have her own standards and her own boundaries. Jasmine, who is less than half his age, has no concept of a boundary, has no concept of what it's like to not be owned, and who can't speak or run away or defend herself, is irresistible enough to him that he, goes for her. This man is a fucking pig. Teo comes home that night and diligently washes the initials off Jasmine, as though he were cleaning a valuable but inanimate object. He's nervous, as if the object could break or come to life. And he takes off all his clothes except his jeans. He calms her down, pets her head, and reassures her as though she could understand. Then, on page 129, he's the one who trembles. What he wants to do is prohibited, but he does it anyway. Something that's easy to miss about this book is the contrast between Jasmine and El Perro, property of Tejo and Spinell respectively. Jasmine is like a gifted head who is owned and sexually exploited by Tejo, we know that, but my theory is that El Perro, Spanish for dog, is livestock too. His gaze is like a dog's, full of unconditional loyalty and contained ferocity. Tejo says that El Perro doesn't speak a word, which we could interpret as being because his vocal cords have been removed, and as we see when he visits Spinell outside hours to give her the old 1-2 buckle my shoe because he knows she sleeps at the shop, El Perro is also there at the shop, so he probably lives there too. When Teo is banging Spinell against the door and making eye contact with a furious El Perro on the other side, I wondered why El Perro didn't just walk away in shame at having to watch this and go and do something else for a bit, unless he's maybe jealous and protective, and maybe it's because Spinell uses him the same way that Teo uses Jasmine, for sexual gratification. Spinell can forge papers the same way that Teo can, being that they're both in the meat trade, and she buys and butchers non-head corpses to sell black market meat through, so she's not above breaking the law. I assume she somehow got her hands on a head and now uses him as bare minimum a slave to help around the shop, and potentially for even more. Bestarika goes to extraordinary lengths to tighten up all the loopholes surrounding Tejo assaulting Jasmine, enjoying her, as they call it legally in that world. Enjoying a female head is a crime punishable by death, a law he himself helped write decades prior when he worked briefly as a domestic head inspector and found a man keeping a domestic head locked in a coffin-sized wooden box under his bed. The specialists that examined her determined that she had been enjoyed in every possible way. The man was sent to the municipi, and the man's wife, who ratted him out because she was disgusted by him having sex with animals, was fined, and the female was confiscated and sold at a low price at an auction because of prescribed enjoyment. Teo is now, ironically, sitting at the other end of that scenario. Semen has to be bought at banks so that the resulting babies will be born with an ID number. Any runaways have to be registered. Slaughters have to be registered, even when they're done at home. This means that Taeho sits waiting for the other shoe to drop for the duration of Jasmine's pregnancy. An inspector calls and is briefly turned away because Taeho knows his boss and is able to call him and get the inspector pulled out, but the inspector warns him that he will return and implies that he won't be turned away so easily next time. Something that really frustrates me about the way people talk about this book is when they say things like, it came out of nowhere, he always treated Jasmine romantically, he seemed to really like her. So the end, where Taeho lets her give birth and then kills her, comes out of nowhere. It drives me insane. Basic kindness is not romance, and in the case of Jasmine, it's barely even kindness. Like, he rapes her and then just looks after her while she's pregnant so that he can have the baby at the end. And what's more, he doesn't treat her like a human being, he treats her like a dog. Taeho had 2 dogs back when the transition began, which again is decades ago, and they were called Coco and Pugliese, and he was forced to euthanize them both, which was obviously very traumatic for him and his father. He attributes his father's mental collapse to this, since Coco was like his father's baby. She even wagged her tail differently when she was around him, and I think he spent more time with Coco than he did with his actual daughter Marissa. And Pugliese was Coco's baby, so there's this whole web of like connected found family in the Taeho home, and he had to kill them even when he suspected the virus was a hoax. He says that he would have preferred to like abandon them in the countryside, but he was worried that their fates would be even worse if they were found out there. He recalls that he and his 2 dogs used to sit out under the tree out back of the family home, and it's under this tree that Taeho begins to take Jasmine. He dances with her there and plays music for her there, the music that he used to play for his dogs, music with no lyrics, no words. Having her as this strange pet/incubator makes his house feel like a home again. Taeho's perspective on Jasmine frustrates me because his observations allow us to see how human she is, but his ignorance keeps him from ever coming to those same obvious conclusions. Like, she accidentally cuts herself when she's trying to use a knife to draw pictures on the floor, so he buys her crayons. She's curious about fire, she learns how to wear clothes, watches TV, sleeps on a bed, draws with her crayons, eats food, and flips through books that she doesn't understand. Taeho, an arsehole, comments he wishes he could teach her to read, but what's the point if she can't speak and will never be a part of society that only sees her as an edible product? Sometimes she would like laugh at the TV, and he does too, without knowing what she's laughing at or why. And he doesn't seem to remember that he actually used to pretend to laugh at the things that Cecilia found funny as well. He feigns this care about her to us because thinking morally is easy, but acting morally is not. He bemoans how she'd never fit into a society that wants to eat her, so I guess I'll have to keep her locked in my house as a forced surrogate and then eat her myself anyway. He watches her sleep on pet cams whilst he's away at work. He ties her to the bed at night so that she doesn't move around the house and potentially hurt herself, and he keeps her locked in her room when he wants some time to himself because she wants physical contact, cuddles and enrichment. She follows him around, which he prefers so that he can keep an eye on her, and says that at times it seems like she's thinking, like she really can. One day he's crying, and though she doesn't understand, she touches his face gently, and it's almost like a caress. Jasmine is abused and exploited, but she's also obviously ignorant, you know, she's a victim who doesn't know enough about the world to know that she's a victim. There's no part of her assumes that her, like, owner, a man who has given her comparatively so much, is going to let her live out her term as an incubator, and then kill her when she's served her purpose. Consequently, she's really happy. She doesn't make any sounds, but her smile vibrates through her body and he finds it infectious. She has no words, so Taeho doesn't see her as human. But she is. Instead of having some actual introspection, Taeho spends all his time lamenting on how awfully she suffered at the hands of other men. He knows she suffered when they did it to her, just as she suffered when they removed her vocal cords so that she'd be more submissive, so that she wouldn't scream when she was slaughtered. Because he's a horrible loser who spends more time bemoaning the life he has worked hard to achieve and now lives in totally compliantly than he does the lives that he destroys. And I hate him. I hate Taeho so much. The second half of this book begins just before Jasmine is due to give birth to the baby that Taeho has already started to refer to as his son. To him it's her birth, but it's his child. So the amniotic fluid starts to come out brownish green, and Taeho, who has been doing lots of reading on this, knows to call Cecilia in that moment. Cecilia is horrified at what she discovers and asks him, like, do you know you're gonna get the death sentence for this? Like, she calls him sick. It's not about the fact that he has committed infidelity by raping a human livestock less than half his age who can't even communicate. It's about the fact that she sees this lower class woman as an animal. She's revolted by it because she interprets it as bestiality. So she's going like, what are you doing? And he goes, the baby is gonna die. And it's a sentence that serves like a slap to the face, and it kind of like spurs her into action. Cecilia boots him out the room because he is making her and Jasmine both nervous, and all he can hear afterwards is her like shouting encouragement to Jasmine, like she coaches her through the birth. The baby is born and Cecilia emerges sweaty and holding the baby. He's ours now, says Taeho, and the two are locked in this like reunion of delusion brought together by this horrible happening, and Jasmine is desperate to hold her baby. Like, she's crying and reaching out and stretching out her arms, and in doing so she like stands up and she like knocks a lamp over, and this earns like a snap of Cecilia and Taeho's attention. Like, they just look over, and Cecilia just goes, get more towels and water to clean her before you take her back to the barn. Like, Cecilia slots so easily into this role of mistress of the household. Exploitation comes naturally to Cecilia, who initially I assumed would be sympathetic to Jasmine. In the spirit of Sergio, the man he's become, Taeho has figured out his personal way of soothing a head before stunning is to sing Summertime in their ear, and he stuns her, and this confuses Cecilia. Jasmine is a fertile female who can provide them with a family, but Taeho doesn't want to let her live to carry another baby, because the inspector will be back, the baby will raise questions, and I assume maybe he couldn't look Jasmine in the eye after stealing her child. But as he drags her to the barn to kill her, Taeho announces she had the human look of a domesticated animal, and the book ends. And that's it. He wins. There are so many more aspects of this book I would love to cover. The lab, the dream sequences, Guerrero and the game reserve, the processing plant tour, Nurse Nelida, etc. But this video is really long, and after a point you're just starting to recite like the nittier and the grittier, and coming to more and more redundant conclusions, and you kind of get like diminished returns if you start to really comb through the finer details. So I am going to choose to stop at this point, but I would love to hear your personal insights and analyses in the comments, and I would love to get an idea of what you lot thought of this book as well. I mean, I have stopped reading the comments as much because the bigger YouTube is alright, it does get really draining, and all it takes is like one nasty message to ruin your entire day. But I'll pop by from time to time and I'll reply to the ones I can. Just sorry if I haven't seemed very present in the comments lately. At the end of the day, tendy flesh is what you make of it, and almost all expectations you're given won't quite touch the core of why this book is worth a read. It's got less gore than your standard slasher movie, and it focuses more on humanity's potential evil, but it will disappoint people who are reading it for the gore that the book is literally marketed on the back of. All of the book cover quotes are about it, all of the marketing paints this as being like this really disgusting gory thing, and it's not really that bad at all. And the thing is, there are some really shocking moments in this book, particularly the rape scene, which is done as a cutaway that serves to be 10 times more horrifying than one written plainly. Like, people say shock value, but I think shock value serves a great role in this story because the value is in the message that would not hit so hard in the same way if the book was scared about being shocking. Gore and extremity has value, and Tendy Flesh is one of the best examples of purposeful, meaningful shock horror in extreme literature. Tricking your audience semi-successfully into backing the man who ends up committing unthinkable evil is the kind of authorial mechanism that earns this book a lot of 0-star reviews from readers who I think are either bitter about being deceived or who struggle to understand that Taeho being the protagonist doesn't automatically mean that Taeho is a good person, and neither is his wife, and they consider the twist to be out of character or poorly signposted, when actually, especially on a second read-through, it is very obvious. You just have to look at what he does and not listen to what he says when he goes on about how tragic it is that we do cannibalism, and then goes on to do arguably worse. Although I've seen many people label Tendy Flesh vegan vegan propaganda. I think this book is more about the treatment of women and lower classes than it is trying to say a message about veganism. Veganism is a footnote in this story. It's an ethical alternative that was shelved alongside the rest of humanity's humanity, but it's abandoned pretty quickly, and there are not a lot of themes in this book that feel particularly vegan. This book is more about the willingness of human complicity, the mistreatment of women and marginalized groups, and the cycle of evil we use to justify our various privileges every day. I think it's worth a read. It's not the best written book for reasons I discussed back at the beginning, but it touches on so many topics I've not really seen covered elsewhere. And Baz Tariq's strength is in writing a truly unreliable narrator who kind of fools even himself. By the end of the book, you will be absolutely sick of him. Anything redeemable about him is dead and gone, and every positive choice he could have made has been abandoned under flimsy justifications. Like, he is the worst. But what this book says about wealth, religion, women, and human connection to nature are real, and they are worth your consideration. Tender as the Flesh is shocking, yes, but shock value has a place, and it drives the message. Nothing in this book feels like rape for the sake of rape or gore for the sake of gore. It all works together to construct a mosaic of scathingly cynical critique. So thank you for watching. If you stuck around this far, thanks for your patience. Please remember to subscribe to the channel for more videos, and have a great day.